The case of Tracey Grissom is one of the most high-profile cases in the US in the 2010s, once again drawing public attention to the issue of domestic violence. The morning of May 15, 2012 forever changed the lives of two families from the town of Tuscaloosa in Alabama. 32-year-old Tracey Grissom took a gun, got behind the wheel of her Chevrolet, and set off in search of her ex-husband Ron. Less than an hour later, Ron was dead, and Tracey had cold-bloodedly called 911 herself and reported the events. Their marriage lasted 8 years and was full of suffering and cruelty. Ron repeatedly beat, raped, and humiliated Tracey. After the divorce, the woman hoped to start a new life, but according to her, Ron continued to stalk and threaten her. Tracey claimed that she killed her ex-husband in defense of her own life. The prosecution, however, accused her of premeditated, planned murder. This ambiguous case split the local community. Some sympathized with Tracey as a victim of years of abuse, while others condemned her as a cold-blooded killer. The trial was a test not only for Tracey, but also for the justice system. Will the jury be able to see beyond one crime the story of exhausting abuse? And most importantly, where exactly is the truth? Now I will tell you everything in detail. My name is Detective Brooks, and you're on the DBS channel. Let's get to the bottom of the truth. Ron Grissom grew up in a family with strong traditions in the small town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The boy was born and raised in a strong, traditional family where an atmosphere of love and support prevailed. His father Ronnie and mother Rose were happy with their sons and proud of their successes. During his school years, Ron was the star of the local baseball team. Everyone remembers him as a cheerful, sociable young man, the life of the party. It seems that this was when he first tried alcohol and marijuana, the usual mischief for boys of that age. However, these seemingly innocent experiments laid the foundation for an addiction that would later ruin his life. After school, Ron, as befits, went to work with his father in the family construction business. It was a good, stable job with prospects for growth in the future. But it seems the guy lacked the drive and thrill. He still liked to relax with friends, drink a couple of beers, and smoke various psychotropic substances. In 2003, fate brought Ron together with Tracey, a blonde a couple of years older than him. She already had an unsuccessful marriage behind her and a young son. But Ron seemed to really fall in love. Despite the warnings of relatives, he married Tracey a year later. At first, everything was going well, but soon problems returned. Substance abuse does not go unnoticed, believe me. Soon quarrels began in the young family, and when their long-awaited daughter Anna was finally born in 2006, after several miscarriages, the situation worsened. The girl was born prematurely with heart defects. The burden of caring for her fell on Tracey's shoulders, while Ron increasingly withdrew from affairs. Instead of being with his wife and children, he increasingly hung out with friends and had affairs on the side. Of course, this infuriated Tracey. She was jealous and made scenes. According to her, that's when Ron first raised his hand to her, although he later denied the beatings. In 2010, Tracey couldn't take it anymore and filed for divorce. It would seem that now Ron had a chance to start all over again, to become a better father to Anna. But no, the ex-wife claims that he still broke into her house, threatened and abused her. Even after the official dissolution of the marriage in 2011, Ron allegedly did not leave Tracey alone. Of course, the man denied all accusations. He said that these were Tracey's fabrications, a way to take revenge on him. He returned to live with his parents, worked in their firm, and tried to get his life back on track. Now let's get to know the other key figure in this tragic story better, Tracey Grissom. The woman was born on November 24, 1976 in the small town of Northport, Alabama. She was the only child of Mike Hennigan, a Vietnam War veteran, and his wife Diane. I suppose her father saw in his daughter the embodiment of his unfulfilled dreams and had high hopes for her future. Tracey grew up to be an active, purposeful girl. She did well in school, played sports, and dreamed of someday mastering the noble profession of a nurse. Everything was going well, and it seemed that a worthy career and a quiet life awaited her. After graduating from school, Tracey entered the local college for nursing courses. There she met her first husband and quickly married for great love. But family idol did not last long. In 2001, when their little son James was born, the relationship had already cracked. A couple of years later, the marriage finally fell apart, and Tracey was left alone with a child in her arms. Perhaps it was then that despair settled in the heart of the young woman. After all, she so longed to find a reliable male shoulder, a loving father for her boy. And then, as luck would have it, fate gives her a second chance, a meeting with Ron Grissom at a party in 2003. Ron was younger than Tracey, but his sincere care for little James melted her heart. A year later, they were married. But dreams of a cozy family crashed again against the harsh reality. Shortly after the wedding, it turned out that Ron had problems with illicit substances. Tracey did not tolerate this, and conflicts began. The birth of their long-awaited daughter Anna in 26 brought the couple together for a while. But the girl was born prematurely, with poor health. The burden of caring for her fell on Tracey. The husband not only did not help, he increasingly plunged into bad habits and behaved aggressively. According to Tracey, from 29, Ron constantly humiliated her, raised his hand to her. It happened that during quarrels, the woman suffered such beatings that she had to make up stories to colleagues about accidental falls down the stairs. I can imagine how unbearable it was for her to hide the bruises under a layer of foundation and pretend that everything was fine. In 2010, Tracey's patience snapped and she filed for divorce. Unfortunately, even after the breakup, the nightmare did not end. From then on, according to Tracey, her life turned into sheer hell. She was afraid to leave the house, suffered from constant anxiety and nightmares. She turned to the police for help, but to no avail. She had to rely only on herself. So the woman bought a gun so, in her opinion, she could protect herself and her children from her furious ex-husband. So, Tracey and Ron's marriage, which lasted 8 long years, was more like hell than a union of 2 loving hearts. Tracey's story paints a horrifying picture. For years, her husband subjected her to inhuman abuse. Beatings, forced sex, death threats. It seems that Ron did not disdain any way to humiliate and intimidate his wife. It was especially scary when he was pumped up with various psychotropic substances or alcohol. At first, Tracey tried to fight. She called the police twice, ran to relatives, but each time, under pressure from Ron, she withdrew her statements. And in return, she received even more brutal punishments from her sadistic husband. Eventually, the woman found herself in a vicious circle of fear from which she saw no way out. She lived as if on a powder keg, expecting a new outbreak of violence at any moment. The last straw, according to Tracey, was a horrific incident in November 2010. Ron broke into her house in the middle of the night, beat her, raped her, and left her unconscious on the bathroom floor. This time, Tracey firmly decided enough is enough. The next day, she went to the hospital and documented all the wounds and bruises. And then she filed an official report with the police, hoping that the abuser would be brought to justice. But the wheels of justice turned slowly. Ron was detained but released on bail. He was forbidden to approach Tracey, but how can that stop an enraged abuser? He violated the ban again and again, came demanding to see his daughter. And it is noteworthy that Ron's parents and friends did not believe in his guilt and supported him in every possible way. Black days began for Tracey. She almost never left the house, afraid of meeting Ron. She armed herself with a gun for self-defense. But there was no peace, day or night. The woman was tormented by nightmares where she again and again found herself in the hands of a rapist. Because of these experiences, she lost a lot of weight and turned grey. Of course, Tracey cherished the hope that Ron would be put behind bars and she would finally be able to start life anew. But the bureaucratic machine stalled. Court hearings were constantly postponed. Ron was at large and did not miss an opportunity to terrorize his victim. In early May 2012, he showed up at her house again with threats. Tracey called the cops, but the scoundrel fled before they arrived. Can you imagine the state of this tormented woman? She did not sleep all night, trembling with fear for her life. And when she found out that Ron had even got a job, although he had previously pretended to be unemployed in order not to pay alimony, her despair reached its limit. The morning of May 15, 2012 turned out to be remarkably clear and warm, but not for Tracey Grissom. Then the 32-year-old woman woke up with a heavy heart and obsessive thoughts about her ex-husband Ron. She was going to a job interview for a nursing position, but she couldn't concentrate at all, because she had just found out Ron, who swore up and down in court that he was unemployed, was actually working again, and this infuriated her to no end. Tracey decided to expose her ex-husband's lies at all costs. She got behind the wheel and headed to the place where Ron usually worked, the construction side of the firm Grissom and Grissom. The plan was simple, to take a few photos of Ron at his workplace and then present them in court as proof of his deception. Approaching the construction site, Tracey saw the company's billboard from afar, and the next moment her heart sank. There was Ron himself. Together with his cousin Dale Dockery, he was just unloading some boat. Tracey parked the car nearby, took out the gun with trembling hands, and headed towards her ex. And here the discrepancies begin. According to Tracey, as soon as Ron noticed her, he immediately rushed in her direction with curses and a threatening look on his face. The woman panicked, pulled out a weapon, and shouted for him not to approach. But he allegedly did not even think to stop. That's when she fired, supposedly defending herself. However, the Dockery brothers tell a completely different version. They say that when Tracey drove up and Ron saw her, he immediately shouted to Dale to call the police, and he himself rushed to flee, trying to hide. But Tracey started shooting after him. Be that as it may, as many as 6 shots were fired. 4 bullets found their target. 1 hit Ron in the shoulder, 1 in the forearm, 2 in the back. The heavily wounded man collapsed to the ground and tried to crawl away. But Tracey came up almost point blank and cold-bloodedly finished him off with 2 shots to the head. Later, the examination will confirm it was these control shots that proved fatal for Ron. After the deed, Tracey returned to the car, put the gun on the hood, and called the police. She told the dispatcher that she had just shot her ex-husband, who had been abusing her for years. She seemed to be asking for help and at the same time confessing to murder. The local police from Tuscaloosa arrived at the crime scene very quickly. Tracey Grissom, surprisingly, did not resist arrest at all. She immediately confessed to the deed, explaining her actions by years of violence from the late Ron. Now her fate was in the hands of the investigators. The detectives thoroughly documented the crime scene, interviewed all possible witnesses, and seized physical evidence, primarily the gun with Tracey's fingerprints. Ron's cousin, who saw the shooting with their own eyes, immediately gave their testimony. According to them, it turned out that Tracey purposefully came to Ron's place of work, called him out to talk, and then started shooting. Moreover, as Dale Dockery claimed, Ron did not show any aggression towards his ex-wife and only tried to escape and hide. The body of the deceased was sent for autopsy, and the conclusions of the forensic experts were unfavorable for Tracey. The bullets that hit Ron in the back when he was already lying on the ground, defeated, turned out to be fatal. These facts clearly did not fit with Tracey's version of self-defense. Rather, they indicated that she had arrived at the meeting with the clear intention to kill her ex-spouse. However, during interrogations, Tracey remained surprisingly calm and consistent. Slowly, in detail, she retold the investigators about the years of suffering she had to endure with Ron. She recalled constant beatings, humiliation, rape. She emphasized that her ex-husband terrorized her even after the divorce, not allowing her to live a normal life. However, the investigation also had other testimonies. Ron's relatives and friends unanimously claimed that recently he had avoided any contact with Tracey, that it was she who constantly pursued him, called him, came to his home and work, made jealous scenes and provoked quarrels. They say that Ron was desperately trying to start life from scratch, and then such a tragedy. Moreover, the detectives did not find any evidence of Ron's visit to Tracey's home on the eve of the murder, which she spoke about. The neighbors interviewed heard and saw nothing of the kind. The surveillance camera recordings also did not record anything suspicious. On the other hand, the ex-wife found several witnesses ready to confirm her words. In particular, her friend Lauren Richards said that Tracey had come to her more than once during that period, hiding from Ron, and Lauren saw with her own eyes numerous bruises and wounds on her friend's body. But as it turned out, all these testimonies concerned events that had happened several years ago. The investigators did not find any evidence that Ron had abused Tracey during the last months before the murder. Instead, their attention was drawn to one strange fact. It turns out that Tracey had a valid life insurance policy on her ex-husband and regularly paid the premiums. Although usually divorced couples terminate such policies. But the most interesting thing is different. The day before the murder, the woman called the insurance company. She admitted that now she really needed money, and she clarified the details of the insurance coverage. Having weighed all the collected facts and testimonies, the prosecutor's office of the district qualified Tracey Grissom's actions as premeditated murder in the first degree. The woman, who allegedly only sought to protect herself from a domestic tyrant, now faced a serious term up to life imprisonment, and only the decision of the jury would determine whether her reprisal against Ron was justified. My God, what drove her to such a desperate act? And was self-defense really the only motive? What other secrets does this horrific story of family hell hide? The case was heard in the Circuit Court of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and attracted considerable attention from the public and the press. No wonder. After all, the defendant's bench was occupied by a victim of domestic violence who took justice into her own hands. In August 2014, after 2 years of investigation, Tracey finally appeared in court. The small courtroom could barely accommodate all those who wanted to see the defendant with their own eyes. There were relatives of the deceased Ron, friends of Tracey, and just concerned townspeople. And where would we be without reporters who were literally hunting for sensational details? And finally, Tracey is brought into the hall. Pale, emaciated, she barely stands on her feet. She sits down next to her lawyer Warren Freeman, who until the last moment hopes to mitigate the charges. Maybe, instead of intentional murder, it will be possible to prove unintentional, committed in the heat of passion. But where there? The prosecutor is adamant. Tracey Grissom must answer under the most serious article. The defense strategy is based on evidence of years of violence that Tracey had to endure from her late husband. Lawyer Freeman provides the court with medical reports made after Ron brutally beat and raped his wife in 2010. Allegedly, the woman is still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and at the time of the murder was in a state of passion. She did not control herself when she shot the abuser. But here the judge makes an unexpected move. He forbids showing the jury photos of the beaten Tracey, taken a few days after the rape. Because, you see, formally these pictures do not prove Ron's guilt, because the case of violence at the time of his death was still pending in court. Such a twist! And the prosecutor, meanwhile, takes the bull by the horns. Instead of digging into the past, he focuses on the events of the day of the murder. Why, he says, did Tracey come to the meeting with Ron armed? Why did she continue to shoot when he was already lying wounded? And most importantly, what got into her the day before to call the insurance company to be interested in payments? The atmosphere in the courtroom is oppressive, electrified. Ron's relatives are openly calling Tracey a cunning murderer who lured her ex into a trap for money. Tracey's loved ones are sobbing as she describes in detail the suffering and fear for her life that she endured. But the biggest blow is yet to come. When asked by the prosecutor if Tracey regrets what she did, she utters a phrase that takes the jury's breath away. "No, if I could turn back time, I would do it again. I only regret not shooting him earlier." After such words, even the most sympathetic jurors begin to doubt. Was she really acting in self-defense? The finale of the trial is expected and no less dramatic. After several hours of debate, the jury finds Tracey Grissom guilty of first-degree murder. No matter what the lawyer said about domestic violence, the reprisal against a defenseless man went too far. The judge gives the defendant the last word, but she only silently shakes her head, eyes downcast. She is given 25 years in prison. Friends, looking through the materials of this case, I couldn't get rid of the thought. If only Ron's abuser had been convicted of domestic violence at the time, would it have come to such a bloody denouement? If the state had provided Tracey with reliable protection, helped to break the toxic connection with the abuser, would she have dared to take the law into her own hands? You see how easily the situation gets out of control when the escalation of violence is not stopped in time, when cries for help are ignored. This tragedy should have been a lesson for all of us. Countering domestic terror is not only a matter for the police or social services. It is a shared responsibility of society, of each and every one of us. Friends, the case of Tracey Grissom is not just another criminal story. It is a wake-up call for our entire society, a kind of litmus test that revealed a whole range of systemic problems, and above all, the problem of domestic violence and the protection of its victims. You see, on the one hand, Tracey's story clearly demonstrated how imperfect our laws are in this area, and how indifferent and helpless law enforcement officers can be. The woman repeatedly turned to the police, begged for help, but she never received reliable protection from her aggressive ex-husband. The system seemed to ignore her suffering, shrugging off her cries for help, and as a result, here you have a bloody denouement. On the other hand, this high-profile case clearly showed even the hell of domestic terror cannot be a justification for lynching. Yes, Tracey suffered terrible, inhuman abuse. Her life turned into a continuous nightmare from which she saw no legal way out. But does this give an indulgence for murder? Especially when the direct threat has already passed, when the offender is not attacking right now. Looking through the case files, I came to a disappointing conclusion. At the moment when the bullets were hitting Ron Grissom, Tracey was not defending her life. She was committing a brutal reprisal, and no matter how painful it is to admit it, the law is not on her side here. The verdict, 25 years behind bars, came like a bolt from the blue for Tracey's relatives and the concerned public. Everyone who had even a little sympathy for this suffering woman was shocked and outraged. Here is her friend Lauren from TV screens cursing the court for callousness and formalism. They say if they had seen all those horrific proofs of torture, their hand would not have risen to condemn the victim so. But unfortunately, from the point of view of law, everything was cast iron. Tracey's case instantly became the main topic of discussion throughout the country. Talk shows, documentaries, newspaper pages, everywhere there was only talk about the fate of this fragile woman. And you know, it's good, because finally they started talking out loud about the hushed-up trouble about domestic violence and the helplessness of its victims. Society, as if by the wave of a magic wand, split into two camps. Some sincerely sympathized with Tracey, called her sentence a social injustice, demanded a review of the case. Others approved of the severity of the judges. They say that nothing, not even years of torture, gives the right to punish and pardon with one's own hand. The law is the law. By the way, Tracey herself did not accept it either. Through her lawyer, she immediately filed an appeal. They say there was pressure on the jury and important evidence was ignored. Unfortunately, as we know, all these attempts were in vain. The higher courts left the verdict unchanged. Probably, deep down, Tracey herself understood there was no way back. All that remained was to accept it and atone for the guilt. From behind the prison walls, she wrote touching letters to her children and parents. She begged forgiveness for the pain she had caused her loved ones. She even gave interviews from behind bars a couple of times. She urged all women who suffer from domestic violence not to remain silent. She said, "Shout at the top of your voice, don't be afraid. Seek protection from the law, not from weapons, because weapons will not lead to anything good." Tracey herself will pay in full for her fatal choice with her freedom. She will see freedom only in 2029, at the age of 53. And she really hopes that at the prison threshold she will be met by her adult children's son James and daughter Anna. Then, perhaps, she herself will promise herself never to repeat the terrible mistakes of the past. Friends, today I want to talk to you about one of the most painful and ambiguous topics in our society. About domestic violence, lynching, and the inexorability of justice. A vivid example of this problem is the case of Tracey Grissom, a woman who was driven to despair by years of abuse by her husband. Can her act really be called self-defense? Where is the line between the victim's right to salvation and the law's obligation to punish the murderer? Let's try to figure it out. A terrifying picture emerges from the case files. Tracey suffered for years from the cruelty of Ron Grissom. Beatings, humiliation, sexual violence, it seems that this man did not disdain anything to break his wife. Even after the divorce, he continued to terrorize her and the children. It is easy to imagine the hell in which this tormented woman lived. At some point, she probably really believed, Ron will not calm down until he kills her or someone close to her. But the law is the law, and it clearly distinguishes between self-defense and lynching. Here I must agree with the conclusions of the investigation. The circumstances of Ron's murder in particular. The control shots into a motionless body do not at all fall under the definition of necessary defense. Tracey clearly crossed the line beyond which fear for one's own life becomes a thirst for reprisal. And no matter how painful it is for us to admit it, according to the letter of the law, she deserved the sentence. Another thing is that this case has become a litmus test for the entire legal system. It exposed glaring gaps in the mechanisms for protecting victims of domestic terror. Well, think for yourself. Tracey repeatedly begged for help, but the police waved their hands every time. They say, "We do not interfere in family quarrels." Left alone with her pain, feeling hopeless, the woman grabbed a weapon. So, don't we have to share responsibility with her for this tragedy? Yes, we are with you. All those who for years watched Ron's bullying and did not intervene. All those who lacked compassion to lend Tracey a shoulder. Finally, all of us who tolerate the silent existence of domestic violence next to us. Is it really necessary to wait for a bloody denouement in order to remedy this trouble? This sad case must awaken our society. We must together create an atmosphere of zero tolerance for violence in the family. Provide victims with reliable protection and support mechanisms. After all, the main conclusion of the Tracey Grissom case is this: no suffering justifies murder. And if we do not want to observe new tragedies, lynching must remain outside of civilization. Some crimes remain unsolved for years, even decades. Case files gather dust in police archives while the perpetrators continue living their lives, starting families and enjoying freedom, a privilege their victims are deprived of. Today, I'll tell you about a killer who managed to evade justice for over a decade and a half. but even he ultimately faced retribution. Rebecca Good was born on April 28, 1982 in the small town of Melbourne, Kansas, USA. With a population of barely 2,000 people, she was one of 4 daughters in the family. When the children were still very young, their parents decided to divorce. The process proved extremely unpleasant for all family members. The father made every effort to gain custody of his daughters, but the court sided with the mother. Despite the difficulties in separation, all the sisters maintained a relationship with their father. They were very close to each other and always took care of one another. As a teenager, Rebecca enrolled in a community college in Arkansas. To live closer to her place of study, she moved to the largest city of Fayetteville, with a population of around 100,000. Here, the girl pursued her education, worked part-time jobs, and prepared to enter university. Rebecca settled into an apartment with her younger sister Danielle, who was also her best friend. A couple weeks after moving, the sisters returned to their hometown of Melbourne to spend time with family and friends. 22-year-old Rebecca, after visiting with relatives, drove Danielle to her boyfriend's house and then went to see her own boyfriend Casey. At that point, they had been dating for about a year. Casey lived in a trailer located on his parents' property. They all had a wonderful weekend together. And then, little by little, they began getting ready to return to their usual work routines. On the morning of Monday, September 20, 2004, Rebecca drove her boyfriend to his job at a fast food restaurant. After that, the girl was seen buying breakfast. Rebecca stopped by a store where she ordered coffee and a sandwich. She planned to pack her things to head back home, where she and her sister were studying. Returning to her boyfriend's trailer, the girl decided to take a little nap, feeling exhausted after an almost sleepless night. Around noon, Rebecca was supposed to pick up Danielle from her boyfriend's place, but the younger sister waited in vain for the older one. The girl assumed Rebecca's plans had changed, so by evening she made her own way to their parents' house. There she gathered some things for the trip and went to bed. The next morning, Danielle hoped to meet her older sister, but she never returned. The girl called Casey, but he hadn't spent the night at home and knew nothing about his girlfriend's whereabouts. The young man was certain Rebecca was long home by now. Other friends and acquaintances also denied seeing her. Hoping to find out if something had happened to her sister, Danielle called the sheriff's department. She reported that the girl had gone missing a little less than 24 hours ago. The police were immediately interested in what happened. Investigators began working through possible scenarios, gathering information from the reporting party. After talking to her, they decided to speak with the last person who saw Rebecca before she disappeared. The police went to Casey's workplace, the missing girl's boyfriend, since he was the last one to see Rebecca. However, the young man told law enforcement that the night before he had stayed at a friend's house, and in the morning he went straight to work. He knew the girl was supposed to leave with her sister and wasn't expecting her to return. But the detectives were alarmed by Casey's decision, especially considering he had a dog that needed care. The young man couldn't leave it for long, although there was someone on his parents' property to look after the animal. The police had no evidence to confirm their suspicions, but investigators still decided to inspect the trailer where the missing girl's boyfriend lived. They requested his consent to search. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed Rebecca's car parked nearby. Inside the trailer, there was a sharp smell of bleach. All the missing girl's things were in place. Her purse, money, cell phone, even the breakfast she bought, the coffee and sandwich, remained untouched. It seemed as if the student hadn't gone anywhere at all. Even her dog, a Pomeranian, was there, which she definitely couldn't have left unattended for long. In the bedroom, the police noticed the heavily crumpled bedding. The duvet was found in the washing machine with traces of blood. A bottle of bleach stood by the bed. Detectives looked under the mattress and saw large fresh red stains on it. Obviously, someone had recently flipped it over, trying to hide these traces. After this discovery, law enforcement's suspicions only strengthened. An examination showed that the blood on the mattress and bedding belonged to the missing girl. Casey became the main suspect in Rebecca's disappearance and probable murder, given the amount of blood found in his trailer. However, several colleagues and the young man's management confirmed that on the day of the disappearance, at 8 a.m., the girl had dropped him off at work. She was whole and unharmed, after which she went about her business and didn't return. The young man worked until 4:30 p.m., and when his shift ended, friends picked him up in a car. This was seen by several witnesses. Casey went to the movies with his buddies for an evening showing, and then they headed straight to one of the friends' houses. The tired young man went to bed and didn't get up until the morning of September 21. From there, he went directly to the fast food restaurant. The friend also confirmed Casey's alibi. It seemed the young man had solid proof of his non-involvement, so there were no grounds for arrest. But investigators still didn't completely rule him out as a suspect. They continued carefully examining the crime scene. All the girl's things remained in the trailer, with the exception of the suitcase she usually took with her on trips. Police suspected that the body could have been hidden in it. Another interesting detail was the absence of one of the legs of the piano that stood in the trailer. According to Casey, this leg had long been loose and would fall off if you bumped the instrument, but he didn't know where it had gone. Maybe it rolled somewhere. Among the versions regarding Rebecca's disappearance, the possibility of her running off with her ex-boyfriend Justin was also considered. The police contacted him, but the young man assured that he had not seen the missing girl and had not maintained any relationship with her for a long time. Meanwhile, the search for Rebecca continued, and a week later, law enforcement received alarming news. On September 27, 2004, the body of the 22-year-old student was found in a ravine near the road. A random witness came across a pit formed by a mound, at the bottom of which lay the dead girl. The victim of the brutal attack was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Rebecca had died about a week ago. This meant that it was on Monday, September 20, after she dropped her boyfriend off at work, that an unknown criminal attacked and killed her. The girl received 2 separate blows to the head with a blunt object. The first broke her nose, and the second was fatal, fracturing her skull. Numerous bruises were found on Rebecca's body, indicating a brutal beating. Interestingly, the shape of the injuries matched the mark that could have been left by the broken leg of the piano, which was not found in Casey's trailer. It was considered the murder weapon, but this piece of evidence could not be found next to the body. The medical examiner found no signs of resistance, so the girl apparently did not expect the attack. So the attack on her was committed by someone she knew, or she was attacked from behind. There were also no signs of sexual assault, so that was not the motive for the crime. Among Rebecca's injuries, a fracture of the hyoid bone was recorded, indicating prolonged and forceful strangulation. After the body was discovered, law enforcement again turned their attention to Casey. Witnesses reported that the girl had long wanted to break up with him, considering the young man to be the main cause of problems in the relationship. His possessive attitudes provoked most of the conflicts, which only intensified after Rebecca moved to another city to study. However, Casey had a reliable alibi. Nevertheless, detectives and many local residents were convinced that he was guilty of the brutal attack, since the murder took place in his house. Investigators desperately tried to link Casey to this tragedy, so they carefully checked all the information about him. But at every stage, the young man had confirmation of his alibi. He was seen by colleagues at work. Benny spent time with friends. There were tickets and payment receipts left. The next morning, Casey showed up at work again and spent the whole day there. His alibi ruled out the possibility of him committing any criminal acts against Rebecca, with whom he couldn't even have crossed paths, unless he slipped away from work unnoticed, but detectives considered that probability too low. Casey worked in a fast food restaurant, constantly in plain sight, so his absence would have been noticed immediately. It was assumed that the girl could have been attacked not on Monday morning, but on Sunday evening, when the young man had no alibi. But here too a contradiction arose. Eyewitnesses claimed that it was Rebecca who brought her boyfriend to work in her car on Monday morning. Moreover, she then stopped by the store to buy breakfast, where she was also seen. The salesman remembered the girl buying a sandwich and a donut, which were later found in her boyfriend's trailer. This confirmed that the employee was not mistaken. So the version about the attack on Sunday had to be quickly discarded. Everything indicated that Rebecca returned to the trailer, and it was there or somewhere nearby that she was attacked. After all her things remained inside, but no signs of a break-in were found in the dwelling, which meant that the girl most likely opened the door herself to someone she knew, or the door wasn't locked at all. Of course, after Casey, other members of his family who lived on the property where the trailer stood fell under suspicion. They all could have communicated and seen the girl, in fact had free access to the young man's home. But it turned out that the father of the family was out of town during that period. He worked as a truck driver and was on an intercity route. Casey's siblings also provided alibis that were quickly confirmed. It turned out that none of his relatives living on the property could have attacked the girl. Meanwhile, the police continued to communicate with the main suspect, Casey, trying to find out new details about the last days of Rebecca's life. The young man admitted that on Sunday evening he saw his cousin, 27-year-old William Miller. He was passing by and stopped for a few minutes at the driveway to talk. Although the visit was brief, investigators latched onto this information. Everything indicated that the victim knew her killer, and it could have been anyone. It became known that William had come to town to help his mother move back from Texas. He arrived that same evening and was in the city during the period of the girl's disappearance, which looked suspicious. Could William have had a motive for committing the crime? To get more information, detectives spoke with him, but couldn't find out anything new. He only confirmed talking to his cousin on Sunday evening, after which he left without seeing Rebecca. Another suspect was a girl named Jenny Fertner, who had long been at odds with Rebecca over her ex-boyfriend Justin. But this time, too, the police failed to find evidence of her involvement in the attack. At the time of the murder, she had a reliable alibi. Gathering information about the last days of the deceased's life, detectives learned that she had met with a guy named J.B. Etsy. There was no romantic relationship between them, but the young man sold her marijuana, for which she owed him $20. Investigators thought he might well have been involved in the murder over money. But during the conversation with him, nothing suspicious was found. The guy claimed that he would never have killed a young girl, even for an amount many times greater than the $20 debt. He successfully passed a polygraph test, so he was released. Another person investigators spoke to was Chris Cantrell. There were several witnesses who claimed he had bragged about an attack on a young student. Of course, the detectives were immediately interested in him. But during interrogation at the police station, Chris denied these claims, and the witnesses with their contradictory statements could not be found. After checking this man, he was released for lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. After this episode, the investigation reached a dead end. Despite public anxiety and pressure from the victim's relatives, the process stalled and did not move forward for several years. During this time, Rebecca's parents constantly reminded about themselves, repeatedly asking for police documents on the case. But they were refused. Eventually, the parents hired a private detective, hoping he could shed light on the circumstances of their daughter's tragic death. But even the professional failed to uncover new details of the bloody attack. Rebecca's relatives even announced a $25,000 reward for information that would help find the killer. But even this did not move the investigation from a dead end. Only in the late 2010s did the case unexpectedly receive a new impetus. Several podcasts covered the girl's brutal murder, drawing public attention to the unsolved crime. In 2018, another episode dedicated to Rebecca's death was released. The host, who was originally from the area, invited the deceased's relatives and friends to talk. They shared their versions of what could have happened. During the interview, one of the witnesses provided shocking information. He personally heard Casey bragging about killing Rebecca. According to this person, they worked together, and one time, when the young man got drunk, he confessed to the deed. But the credibility of this testimony was in doubt. First, Casey's confession allegedly took place 8 years ago, when he was intoxicated. Moreover, the witness was also under the influence, and despite all this, for some reason he did not report what he heard to the police. It's quite possible that his story for the podcast was just an attempt to attract attention to himself, to get publicity. In addition, it turned out that this witness's wife had an affair with Casey, so the man could just be looking for a way to get back at his rival. However, even this dubious information forced detectives to return to the investigation and take up the case with renewed vigor. In 2020, a new special agent with the Arkansas State Police was ordered to reopen the investigation into Rebecca's murder. He decided to start from scratch. First of all, he interrogated everyone who could have been involved in the crime. During numerous conversations, the investigator only confirmed the old alibis, and suddenly it turned out that the only person who was in Casey's trailer shortly before Rebecca's death and had no alibi was his cousin William Miller. The police had spoken to him back in 2004, but at the time he denied any involvement in the murder. Since then, William had been completely forgotten about, but it turned out that over the years he had divorced his wife and moved to the Philippines. There he got into a relationship with another woman, with whom he started a new family and had 2 children. In the Philippines, William owned a large farm of about 12 hectares, where the family raised livestock and tended plantations that provided them with a livelihood. The couple's older son spoke English quite well, while the younger daughter knew only a few phrases, preferring the local Bisaya language. William himself worked in the oil industry and taught at the School of Equatorial Hygiene. The police suspected that his life abroad was actually related to an attempt to avoid paying taxes. After all, although he was an employee of a North American company, Being outside the United States, he did not have to pay taxes. So William constantly shuttled between the Philippines, West Africa, and the United States. He visited his homeland to see relatives, get treatment, and periodically appeared at the office of the oil company he worked for. In any case, the new investigator who took over the investigation was eager to talk to this suspicious man. Unfortunately, due to his constant traveling, it was not easy to contact him. The detective had to be patient and wait for William's return. Intuition told him that Casey's cousin might know more about the brutal attack of 2004 than he had told at the time. Back in 2019, several journalists created a social media group dedicated to this unsolved crime. Interestingly, William joined it quite quickly. Of course, he had no idea that he was under the close attention of the police, because the details of the reopened investigation were kept secret. William's name did not appear in any of the podcasts, and no one outside considered him a suspect. He was a little-known member of Casey's family, with whom few people communicated closely. Therefore, this person was simply forgotten about, but for detectives, he had long been on the list of potential criminals. On the day of the murder, William had been in town for several days, helping his mother move, and in fact had access to Casey's trailer. It was this fact that caught the attention of the new investigator, and also the fact that shortly after the crime, the suspect left the country, which also looked strange. When William joined the social media group, he immediately aroused the interest of other members. The fact is that all the subscribers knew each other, had their own close-knit community, and then suddenly a man who lived so far away in the Philippines and could hardly know anything about this case joined, so his excessive interest seemed suspicious. At the same time, William demonstrated a surprisingly good knowledge of the circumstances of the murder, was literally obsessed with this topic, time after time commenting on the details of the student's death, sending newspaper clippings and eyewitness accounts that other group members did not have access to and which had not yet been made public. Community subscribers claimed that William talked about the place where the girl's body was found and also shared his suspicions that Casey's neighbors were involved in the crime. This greatly alarmed the other members of the group. One of the girls, who was well versed in genealogy, analyzed the information and found that William was the cousin of the deceased's boyfriend. This discovery caused alarm in everyone. After considering the situation, the community members decided to pass the collected information to the Arkansas State Police. Law enforcement officials were interested in this information. William's behavior, his joining the group, his obsessive discussion of the murder theme resembled the actions of a criminal who monitors the progress of the investigation and tries to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But the police's hands were tied because the suspect was in another country and there was no way to interrogate him. Although there was an extradition agreement between the USA and the Philippines, more compelling grounds were needed to extradite a person. All that remained was to wait for William to return to the States on his own. In order not to miss his arrival, law enforcement officials warned the customs services. The man's passport was entered into the appropriate database. It was assumed that the system would automatically report his appearance at the border, and then customs officers would quickly contact the police. And so it happened. In October 2020, William flew to Arkansas to visit his family, who now lived there. The detective learned of his arrival. When police called the suspect's mother, she assured that her son had not appeared in the country for over a year. But this was a lie because law enforcement officials already knew that he had crossed the US border. Later, the woman explained her insincerity by the fact that she did not believe in the conversation with the police and thought that some ill wishers of William were trying to find him. Eventually, the police managed to arrange a meeting with William at the station on November 7, which he attended. Finding himself in the interrogation room, the suspect immediately declared his readiness to cooperate and provide any information necessary for the investigation. He assured that he had nothing to hide. Despite the fact that the man was suspected of murder, the detectives initially decided not to focus on this. The conversation began casually, from afar, with innocent questions in order to win over the suspect and give him the opportunity to open up. At first, the investigators were interested in William's current life and his frequent moves. He talked about his busy schedule and life, gradually relaxing. Further, the detectives showed interest in his work, place of residence and daily routine at the time of Rebecca's murder. William reported that he was then working on a 7-on-7-off schedule, that is, a week of 10-12 hours a day, and then the same amount of rest. Shortly before the tragic death of the student, his mother moved from Arkansas to Texas, and he helped her with the move. But she did not like the new state, so the woman decided to return back. William used one of his weeks off to help his mother return home. That is why he found himself in the city during the period when Rebecca Good was murdered. The police gradually approached the most important questions. It turned out that William was not very close to his cousins, although they occasionally met and communicated. According to him, he had been to his cousin's trailer only a few times, but did not remember this happening in 2004. Then the police tried to clarify the circumstances of William's meeting with Casey in September 2004. He confirmed that he did visit him while living in the house with his mother. According to the suspect, he had little communication with his cousin because he was constantly working. William saw him and the girl only in the evening, and it seemed to him as if they had some kind of quarrel. However, this aroused even more suspicion, because the young people's loved ones claimed that they did not quarrel that evening. William said that he had been to his cousin's trailer several times, but did not mention to the police about communicating with him on September 19, the day before Rebecca's death. He kept silent about this until the very end, and the detectives also did not tell him about their awareness. They tried to lead the suspect to a confession. According to William, he arrived in Kansas only on the evening of Sunday, September 19, when it was already getting dark, and stayed with his mother. In the morning, they took his younger brother to school together, and then spent the whole day packing things. On Tuesday, William rented several trucks for the move. It was during this period that police officers who came to search began working around his cousin's trailer. But he never mentioned seeing Casey and Rebecca. After that, the detectives told about their awareness of the communication between Casey and William on September 19, 2004. However, the suspect began to deny that he did not remember exactly and suggested that this meeting took place at a different time. The detectives continued to maintain a relaxed atmosphere and asked the man to provide DNA samples. He immediately refused, explaining that his DNA could have remained on the furniture items during his cousin's visit. The detectives explained to William that they would compare the DNA not with samples from the furniture, but with specific physical evidence from the crime scene. But they still could not convince him. In fact, no DNA of the killer was found at the crime scene, so the detectives just wanted to check his reaction. At the same time, the suspect agreed to take a polygraph test. Before the test began, he was clearly nervous. William claimed that he was taking medications that affected his blood pressure, so he was afraid of the low accuracy of the results. However, in reality, such problems do not affect the effectiveness of the test, which he was informed about. The polygraph examiner managed to calm the suspect down, but this did not help him successfully pass the test. William failed the polygraph, which automatically increased the police's suspicions. The interrogation continued. The investigators were determined to break the suspect. To do this, they used the same tactic that they used on Casey in the first year after the girl's murder. Then they photographed his car and tried to convince the young man that Rebecca's blood was found on the gas pedal. Of course, this was a trick to get the criminal to give himself away, but it didn't work with Casey. He continued to argue that it was possible, so the police assumed that the young man was indeed innocent. To pull the same thing on William, they had to track down and photograph his old pickup truck, which he owned at the time of the crime. When the police played the same trick, informing him that Rebecca's blood was found on the pedal of his car, it worked. The man suddenly began to stutter, get confused in his testimony. He was even more nervous, and his story instantly changed. As soon as the suspect believed that Rebecca's blood was found in his old car, he said that on the day of the crime he saw an unknown young man. He arrived in a white car, which he left near the back porch of the house. William saw the suspicious man quickly disappear from the scene alone, and he thought that his cousin's trailer had been robbed. When he ran inside to make sure of this, he saw not the consequences of a robbery, but blood on the bedding. In his opinion, Rebecca was attacked and kidnapped, and then probably killed. Of course, the detectives could not believe it, because according to his confession, the criminal acted alone. Moreover, there was no reason to hide this information for 16 years. When he was exposed in a lie, William stated that he was ready to confess. According to him, on Monday morning he went hunting in the woods behind his grandfather's house. He knocked on the trailer where Rebecca was and asked to use the phone. Suspecting nothing, the girl let him in. However, this was a trick because he wanted to hunt for more interesting prey Rebecca. He was very nervous, so he accidentally touched the piano, and its leg broke off and fell. Then he grabbed the girl and beat her half to death, and then strangled her with golf clubs to make sure she was dead. After the massacre, he packed the body in a suitcase. He cleaned up the crime scene, collected the bloody bedding, sent some of it to the laundry.
he turned the mattress over, took the body out in his pickup truck and threw it into a ravine. Moreover, on the way, he drove past the police station, not even afraid that he might be noticed or accidentally stopped. On the way back, he got rid of the piano leg and suitcase, indicating the place. The criminal just continued to live as if nothing had happened. He returned home in such a way that his mother did not even notice her son's absence while packing things. Then they made the move as planned. The motives for the brutal murder of Rebecca remained a mystery. William categorically denied any intentions to abuse the girl. Valuables were also not stolen from the crime scene. The suspect claimed that it was a spontaneous attack of aggression that got out of control. According to him, Rebecca did not provoke or offend him in any way, so there were no obvious reasons for the attack. William just wanted to shed someone else's blood. For a long time, the police were puzzled by one question. Why did William, having arrived in the Philippines and learning from his mother about the officer's call, not run away, but agreed to meet with the detectives? The man admitted that for many years he had been lying to everyone about this incident in order to make sure of his inviolability. He was absolutely sure that his involvement in the crime could not be proven. Therefore, without any hesitation, William appeared at the police station, hoping to finally remove all suspicions from himself and live carefree on. When the suspect was finally exposed, the investigators decided to use another cunning trick. The criminal acted too confidently, methodically, and accurately. There was a suspicion that William might have other crimes behind him. The detectives hinted to him that they were aware of his involvement in a number of other murders. Surprisingly, this tactic worked. As it turned out, this seemingly ordinary family man and father was a real serial killer. According to William himself, he took the life of his first victim at the age of 20. Since then, the man had constantly stalked pretty blonde girls, whom he brutally beat and strangled to death. Police officers unfolded a map of the area in front of the suspect. William, without hesitation, marked several points on it where, according to him, the bodies of the dead girls could be found. In total, he indicated 6 burial sites of the victims. 4 of them, according to the killer, were girls of easy virtue, and 2 were random passers-by whom he chose for no apparent reason. Later, William let slip that in addition to these victims, there could be 5 more girls whose disappearances occurred under similar circumstances. According to the suspect, he never robbed his victims. He chose girls who provided intimate services only because they were easy to lure into a trap, and hardly anyone would look for them after they disappeared. He admitted that he felt incredible excitement at the moment when the victims undressed, and then suddenly attacked from behind and strangled them with their own clothes. At this point, William's revelations about the fate of other victims stopped. He no longer wanted to talk to the investigators. The court took into account all the evidence, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to release.
It all began on February 10, 2004, when an event shook the small suburb of Altamont Springs in the state of Florida. A young girl and her boyfriend committed a horrific crime that shocked the local community with its brutality and cynicism. It involved the girl's father, a baseball bat, and a garbage container. Even after years of investigation, many details of this chilling act remain a mystery. Courtney Schulhoff, a young resident of Altamont Springs, found herself at the center of this gruesome story. A combination of youthful maximalism, immaturity, and a desire for revenge pushed her to commit a terrible crime, the murder of her own father. This case vividly demonstrates the tragic consequences that uncontrolled emotions and a lack of common sense can lead to. Altamont Springs, a cozy town with a population of about 40,000, is located in the heart of Florida, in Seminole County. Usually, it's a peaceful and safe place, ideal for family life and recreation. Its proximity to many tourist attractions makes Altamont Springs an attractive place to live. However, behind the external gloss and hospitality lies a dark side, as evidenced by the shocking case of Courtney Schulhoff. The quiet community of Altamont Springs became the arena for a chilling family drama that led to cold-blooded murder. This story reminds us that evil can hide behind a mask of ordinariness, and that even seemingly prosperous families can harbor terrible secrets. Courtney Christine Schulhoff was born in sunny Florida on December 27, 1987. Her parents were Stephen and Tracey Schulhoff, but unfortunately, their marriage did not stand the test of time. The divorce of her parents was a heavy blow for young Courtney, leaving a deep mark on her soul. After her mother left the family nest, the girl remained under the care of her father in the house where she spent her childhood. However, the lives of Stephen and Courtney underwent further changes when financial difficulties forced them to move to a new home. Initially, this news did not enthuse Courtney, but over time, she came to terms with the new circumstances. It seemed that life was gradually getting back on track, and the first few months in the new place were relatively calm. In 2003, Courtney was a student at Lyman High School. Once a diligent and successful student, after her parents' divorce, she began to rapidly lose interest in education. Skipping classes and indifference to grades turned the once promising student into an outsider. But changes were happening not only within the walls of the school. Outside the educational institution, Courtney fell under the influence of a dubious company. New friends with mixed reputations became her guides into a world far from the one she was used to. These acquaintances had a detrimental effect on the girl's personality, gradually changing her values and priorities. I have seen many similar stories. Parental divorce often becomes a trigger for problematic behavior in teenagers. A lack of attention, emotional instability, and a desire to be accepted in a new environment can push young people down the wrong path. However, even in the darkest times, there is always hope for change if the warning signs are recognized in time and a helping hand is extended. I could hardly believe my ears when I heard what happened next. Courtney's transformation was not limited to just her outward appearance. Her behavior became brazen and rebellious, challenging everyone around her. Naturally, the main blow was taken by her father, who embodied the main authority in the girl's life. Fierce conflicts erupted between them, fueling the fire of hostility and misunderstanding. The tension reached its peak when Courtney decided to temporarily move in with her mother, Tracey, seeking refuge from her father's control. However, this step proved to be short-lived. Tracey quickly realized that she was not ready to accept the new version of her daughter with all her problems and challenges. So, having no other choice, Stephen was forced to open the doors of his home to his prodigal daughter once again. Courtney's return home brought no relief. On the contrary, old problems flared up with renewed vigor, especially the issue of school attendance. The girl skipped classes more and more often, seeking solace in the company of her dubious friends. One of their favorite meeting places was the running track located near Lyman High School. It was here that fate brought Courtney together with Michael, a 20-year-old college student. A spark ignited between them, quickly growing into a passionate romance. It seemed that in Michael's arms, the girl found what she had been missing: so much understanding, support, and a sense of her own significance. However, would this meeting become a lifeline for Courtney, or, on the contrary, further entangle her in the web of problems? I have seen more than once how young people, finding themselves at a crossroads, seek salvation in romantic relationships. However, this is often just an illusion that hides the true roots of the problem. Without proper attention and help from loved ones, such connections can become a catalyst for even greater upheavals and dramas. Michael Morin, Courtney's new chosen one, seemed to be the complete opposite of the girl. A former high school football player, he demonstrated remarkable success in his studies, regularly receiving the highest grades. After entering a nearby college, Michael continued to follow the right path, meeting the expectations of his parents. However, meeting Courtney became a turning point in his life. Several weeks of intense communication turned their relationship into something more than just a teenage infatuation. Michael and Courtney became inseparable, spending every free moment together. Their obsession with each other overshadowed everything else, and soon Courtney practically stopped attending school, finally putting an end to her education. The news that his daughter had unofficially dropped out of school came as a real shock to Stephen Schulhoff. As a father who constantly fought with Courtney over her poor academic performance, he immediately saw the root of the problem in Michael. From the very beginning, a strong tension arose between them, which only exacerbated Courtney's already difficult relationship with her father. The girl perceived her father's dissatisfaction as an unwillingness to see her happy. Time and again, she tried to convince Stephen that Michael was a good person worthy of his trust. But the man remained adamant, as rumors had reached him about the young man's dark past associated with car theft. Stephen sincerely sought to warn his daughter against rash steps, but his words only met with a deaf wall of misunderstanding and stubbornness. I have witnessed similar situations more than once. Youthful infatuation often clouds the mind, causing young people to ignore the voice of reason and the advice of their elders. However, it is at such moments that it is extremely important to find the right approach so as not to push the child away, but to help them see reality. Unfortunately, in the case of Courtney and Stephen, it seems it was already too late for compromises. I was stunned when I learned about the unexpected twist in this story. The conflict between Courtney and her father Stephen reached a boiling point. The girl began to openly accuse him of abuse, and unfortunately, there were some grounds for this. One time, the situation spiraled out of control when Courtney invited friends over, including Michael. Stephen, returning home earlier than expected, caught them smoking and drinking alcohol. The enraged father burst into the room where the improvised party was taking place. Not holding back his emotions, he began to reproach his daughter for arranging a get-together without his permission. Screams and accusations filled the space, and eventually, in front of Courtney's friends, Stephen slapped her across the face. This moment became a turning point, as now the girl had real evidence of physical abuse by her father. Despite the seriousness of the situation, neither Courtney nor Stephen took any steps to resolve it. Instead, their relationship continued to plummet into an abyss of mutual resentment and disrespect. Although the girl had dropped out of school, she refused to look for a job. Instead, she used her father's credit card without permission, buying expensive clothes and things online. Courtney would bring home boxes of new purchases, disregarding Stephen's worsening financial situation. I have seen many similar situations where family conflicts reach a critical point. A lack of mutual understanding, an unwillingness to compromise, and the selfish actions of each party only intensify the tension. In the case of Courtney and Stephen, it seemed that they found themselves in an enchanted circle of mutual claims and grievances from which there was no way out. However, even in the most difficult situations, there is always a chance for reconciliation if both parties are willing to take a step towards each other. Perhaps if Stephen and Courtney had found the strength to sit down at the negotiating table, listen to each other, and try to find common ground, they could have avoided the tragic consequences. But unfortunately, they chose a different path, the path of confrontation and escalation of the conflict. The next fragment of this story made me hold my breath. Despite the escalation of the conflict, Courtney continued to act against her father's will. For several months, she secretly invited Michael to their home for overnight stays while Stephen was asleep. Even after her father categorically forbade her from seeing the young man, the girl found ways to circumvent this restriction. Instead of sneaking out to meet him, she openly brought Michael home whenever she pleased. Every conversation between Courtney and Stephen turned into a battlefield. The father did not spare harsh words towards his daughter and her chosen one, which only deepened the gulf between them. Over time, the situation became increasingly unmanageable, and it seemed that reconciliation was no longer possible. But one day, Stephen took an unexpected step. Upon opening his checkbook, he noticed that several pages were missing. Without hesitation, the man called the police and filed a report against his own daughter, hoping it would be a harsh lesson for her. After talking to the investigator, Courtney returned home, feeling a new level of fear towards her father. From now on, she perceived him not just as a strict and cruel authority figure, but as a real threat to her well-being. Personally, I have witnessed similar family dramas more than once. Conflicts between parents and children, especially during the teenage years, can be extremely exhausting and destructive. However, involving law enforcement in resolving family problems is always a last resort. Often, it only worsens the situation, undermining trust and creating an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. In the case of Courtney and Stephen, it seems all chances for a peaceful resolution of the conflict were lost. Instead of trying to find common ground, they chose the path of escalating the confrontation. By filing a report against his daughter, the father crossed a line after which a return to normal relations became practically impossible. The fear and resentment that gripped Courtney only fueled her desire to break free from Stephen's control at any cost. What happened next seemed unbelievable, but it was the truth. Courtney, consumed by fear and despair, was ready to do anything to get rid of the threat her father posed. But life made its own adjustments, further complicating the already tense situation. At the end of 2003, Stephen began dating a woman named Elaine. The details of their acquaintance remained a secret, but the very fact of her father's new relationship added fuel to the conflict. During the same period, Courtney, trying to somehow put her life in order, signed up for courses to obtain a high school diploma. At the same time, she continued to meet with Michael, despite Stephen's constant attempts to hinder their relationship. Eventually, the lovers, tired of the endless pressure, decided to run away together. The only obstacle on the path to their cherished freedom was the lack of transportation and money. Courtney and Michael's plan was simple: take the young man's father's car and head to Maryland, where they hoped to find shelter and financial support from the girl's grandparents. But as often happens, even the most well-thought-out plans can fail. Having stolen the car, the lovers set off on their journey, full of hope for a better future. However, halfway to Maryland, they suddenly changed their minds and turned the car back towards home. What exactly prompted them to take this step remains a mystery, but the consequences of this act, especially for Michael, proved to be extremely unfavorable. I have seen it when young people, consumed by despair and a desire to break free from parental control, resorted to rash actions. Running away from home, stealing a car, all this seems like a solution to problems in the short term. But reality quickly puts everything in its place, and the consequences of such actions can be devastating for all parties involved. In the case of Courtney and Michael, their attempt to escape only worsened the already tense situation. Instead of finding freedom and understanding, they found themselves facing new challenges and threats, and although the reasons for their sudden decision to return home remain unknown, it can be assumed that fear of uncertainty and awareness of the real consequences of their actions played a significant role in this choice. What I learned next turned this case into a real labyrinth of secrets and mysteries. Michael's parents, just like Stephen, decided to turn to the law to punish their son for stealing the car. The young man found himself behind bars, where he spent a long 70 days pondering his actions and future. After his release, Michael was given a probationary period, but this was only the beginning of his problems. The young man's parents, convinced that Courtney had a detrimental effect on their son, began to insist on ending the relationship. From the outside, it was obvious that Michael and Courtney's relationship was far from healthy and constructive. However, neither the lovers nor their parents realized how much worse things could get. This was especially true for Stephen, Courtney's father, who did not even suspect that his life would be tragically cut short a few months later. After Michael's return from imprisonment, the situation escalated to a critical point. The young man's parents, especially his father, continued to pressure their son, demanding that he break off his relationship with Courtney. But Michael was adamant in his decision to stay with his beloved. This led to his angry parents kicking the young man out of the house, leaving him homeless. Finding himself on the street, Michael found shelter in the most unexpected place, the apartment of his girlfriend's father. Under the cover of night, he would sneak into Stephen's dwelling to spend the night there. It wasn't the first time the young man had secretly stayed in the apartment, but now it had become a daily routine. From a detective's point of view, this situation was explosive. The tension between Michael, Courtney, and Stephen had reached its peak, and any little thing could become the spark that would ignite this powder keg. Michael's nightly visits, his presence in the house despite Stephen's categorical prohibition, created an atmosphere of constant fear and mistrust. All the participants in this drama seemed to be blinded by their emotions and desires, not noticing the obvious risks and dangers. The lovers sought to be together at any cost, not realizing that their actions only worsened the situation. The parents, in turn, tried to control the lives of their children, not realizing that excessive pressure only pushed them into each other's arms. What happened next exceeded all my wildest assumptions. The situation with Michael and Courtney was rapidly spiraling out of control. The young man, having left his college education, actually settled in Stephen's house without his knowledge or consent. Moreover, Michael even changed his official address to Courtney's father's residence and listed his home phone number as a contact person in his parole plans. All of this was happening behind Stephen's back, who had no idea of the extent of Michael's intrusion into his life. Despite the fact that the young man had effectively become homeless, he made no effort to find a job and provide for himself. Instead, all the expenses fell on Courtney's shoulders, who shamelessly used her father's credit card. When the card's limit was exhausted, Stephen planned to have a serious conversation with his daughter about her irresponsible behavior. But fate had other plans, and what happened next forever changed the lives of all the participants in this drama. On February 10, 2014, Elaine, Stephen's new companion, tried to call him several times, but to no avail. Worried by the long silence, the woman decided to personally visit her beloved's home. Sometime between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, Elaine got behind the wheel of her car and headed to Stephen's residence. What she saw as she approached the house instantly aroused her suspicion. On the sidewalk, she noticed Michael, Courtney's boyfriend, walking Stephen's dog. He was wearing one of the homeowner's t-shirts, which in itself was strange. But what alarmed Elaine the most was Michael's reaction when their eyes met. The young man, seeing her in the car, instantly rushed to call someone, as if he had been caught at the scene of a crime. This behavior only intensified the feeling that something was very wrong. As an experienced detective, I know that intuition rarely fails in such situations. Although Elaine had no direct evidence, she felt that Michael's strange behavior concealed something sinister. His presence in Stephen's house, his free use of the owner's belongings, and his instant panicked reaction to Elaine's appearance were all alarming signals that could not. Elaine, wasting no time, got out of the car and headed for the front door of Stephen's house. At the threshold, she met Courtney, but the door was locked. When asked about her father's whereabouts, the girl shrugged, replying that she had no idea. Then she walked away, leaving Elaine standing in front of the closed door without a key. The woman noticed that Stephen's truck was still parked in its usual spot and decided to call the police. Local law enforcement officers arrived at Elaine's call and, having obtained a search warrant, entered the house through the back door. What they found inside stunned even the seasoned cops. In Stephen's bedroom, the walls were splattered with blood, and a bloodied baseball bat lay near the bed. But the most horrifying sight awaited them in a plastic garbage can the owner's mutilated body with a torn-off ear and a shattered face. Whoever committed this crime wasn't too concerned about hiding the traces. In addition, the police found bank statements on the dining table, some of which were marked with a pen. Courtney was nowhere to be seen. Elaine, who knew about the tense relationship between Stephen, his daughter, and her boyfriend, immediately suspected foul play. Law enforcement quickly organized a search for the suspects, but as it turned out, neither Courtney nor Michael tried too hard to escape or hide. The young man was found in the restroom of a nearby shopping mall, wearing Stephen's t-shirt, just as Elaine had said. He had the victim's wallet, car keys, and credit cards on him. Michael was detained for questioning. As for Courtney, it was even simpler. The girl turned herself in to the police at her mother's house. During interrogations, Courtney and Michael gave completely different testimonies. The young man initially claimed that he was living in the basement of Stephen's house, knew nothing about his death, and received the items from Courtney. He explained his escape to the mall by fear that the homeowner would find out about his presence. But when the police informed Michael about the murder, he suddenly changed his testimony. With tears in his eyes, the young man stated that everything happened as if in a fog, and he came to his senses already with a bloody bat in his hands. Michael confessed to the crime, but insisted that he acted at Courtney's instigation, who asked him to kill her father because of a conflict over money spent from a credit card. His story sounded confusing and unconvincing. Courtney, during the first interrogation, blamed everything on Michael, assuring that she only learned about her father's death from the young man. But later, in a separate confession, she told the detectives more details. According to her, the idea of murder belonged to Michael, and she only helped to take Stephen's dog out of the room and prepared the bat. While the young man was dealing with her sleeping and defenseless father, Courtney heard every sound. But the most unexpected twist occurred in September 2006, when at the final stage of the trial, Courtney was found guilty. Asked if she wanted to say something, the girl, who had been denying her involvement all this time, suddenly stated, "I would like to openly admit that Michael Morin is not the murderer of my father. I take full responsibility and accept the sentence handed down to me." This shocking statement was heard in the courtroom where Courtney Schulhoff was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. She listened to the verdict without visible emotion. Less than a year later, in April 2007, the trial of Michael Morin took place. He faced the death penalty if found guilty. And again, Courtney repeated that only she committed the crime and Michael knew nothing about it. However, her words contradicted the testimony of the young man himself, who even added new details allegedly. He and Courtney stopped by McDonald's and thought about throwing Stephen's body off a bridge. In the end, Michael Morin was also found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. According to information from 2017, Courtney Schulhoff's sentence was reduced to approximately 40 years. This case remains one of the most enigmatic in my practice. Despite the fact that both criminals received their deserved punishment, it is still unclear what really happened on that fateful night. Undoubtedly, Stephen was killed with a baseball bat, but who dealt the fatal blow remains an open question. On the one hand, Courtney confessed to killing her father. On the other hand, Michael also admitted his guilt, and it was in his basement that Stephen's bloody t-shirt, which the young man often wore, was found. Moreover, Michael was much larger and stronger than Courtney, so he had enough strength to deal with the victim using a bat. However, we should not forget that Stephen was sleeping and could not resist. And Courtney was able to describe the course of the crime in detail and even characterize her father's dying sounds. So who actually committed this brutal murder? This is Travis, a young man born on July 28, 1977 in sunny California, was a sales department employee. His parents were Horror David and Lisa Butt Morgan, an ordinary American family. One September day in 26, fate brought Travis together with an aspiring photographer, a 26-year-old blonde named Jodi Arias. It happened at a professional conference in vibrant Las Vegas, dedicated to prepaid and legal services, where Travis was representing his company. Jodi Arias, despite her young age, was already actively seeking opportunities to collaborate with a company where Travis worked. Their acquaintance happened spontaneously, but from the first minutes there was an incredible chemistry between them. They communicated perfectly, as if they had known each other all their lives, and seemed to have a lot in common. Wanting to continue their communication in a more private setting, Travis invited Jodi to his company's official dinner as his personal guest. It was there, amidst business conversations and glasses of wine, that a spark ignited between them, which later grew into a passionate romance. Jodi was enchanted by Travis's sense of humor, ease, and cheerful disposition. Next to him, she felt comfortable and carefree, forgetting about all her troubles. Their meetings became regular, filled with laughter, passion, and dreams of a shared future. As an experienced detective, I would note that often it is precisely such seemingly perfect acquaintances that can lead to unpredictable and even tragic consequences. Behind the mask of attractiveness and friendliness, dark secrets and dangerous intentions can hide. However, at that moment, nothing foreshadowed trouble. The lovers enjoyed each other's company, making plans for the future and not suspecting what a dramatic turn their relationship would take. From the outside, it seemed that Travis and Jodi were a perfect couple, created by fate itself. They complemented each other, shared common interests and dreams. However, as practice shows, often behind the ideal facade, deep cracks hide that can destroy even the strongest relationships. And this case was no exception. After that fateful acquaintance at the conference, Jodi decided to end her relationship with her then boyfriend and dive headfirst into a romance with Travis. However, distance stood in the way of their happiness. The lovers lived in different states. Travis lived in another region, while Jodi remained in Palm Desert, California. But this did not become an obstacle to their feelings, and they continued to keep in touch despite the geographical remoteness. According to one of Travis' friends, Jodi made the impression of a very attractive and friendly girl. Her long blonde hair and slender figure could not leave any man indifferent. During a joint dinner with Travis, they constantly talked about something, and from the outside, it seemed that a genuine mutual affection had arisen between them. Travis and Jodi's relationship developed rapidly, despite the distance. They constantly communicated by phone, exchanged messages, and tried to see each other in person as often as possible. It seemed that nothing could overshadow their happiness. However, I would note that not all of Travis' friends shared his admiration for the new girl. Some of them, who had the chance to get to know Jodi better and observe the development of their relationship, felt a certain uneasiness. Perhaps it was some kind of sixth sense that hinted that something disturbing was hiding behind Jodi's attractive appearance and sweet smile. But lovers rarely listen to the advice of friends, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Travis was so enchanted by Jodi that he did not pay attention to the warnings of those around him. He was convinced that he had found his true love and was ready to fight for this relationship no matter what. As practice shows, often at the beginning of a romance, during the so-called rose-colored glasses period, lovers do not notice obvious alarming signs in the behavior of their other half. They idealize their partner, attributing desired qualities to them and ignoring potential flaws. And only with time, when the euphoria subsides and the relationship reaches a new level, true faces and intentions begin to reveal themselves. But despite all the warnings, Travis and Jodi continued to enjoy their romance. They made plans for the future, dreamed of a life together, and were ready to overcome any obstacles on the way to their happiness. However, as time will tell, sometimes the greatest danger lurks from those we love the most. And right now, the crack in the relationship that I will tell you about will happen. The more people hear this story, the more people can draw conclusions for themselves and protect themselves from similar circumstances. This is very important. Despite the passionate feelings and plans for a shared future, after 5 months, Jodi and Travis' relationship reached a dead end. They decided to break up, but as often happens in such cases, they could not completely sever the connection. The former lovers continued to maintain physical intimacy and communicate as if nothing had changed. At first, it seemed that such a format of the relationship suited them perfectly. They remained a part of each other's lives, but without burdensome obligations and promises. But everything changed when Travis started dating another woman. The news of her ex-boyfriend's new passion came as a real blow to Jodi. She could not come to terms with the thought that Travis now belonged to another. Jealousy clouded her mind, pushing her to reckless actions. Jodi began to obsessively follow Travis' life on social media. She hacked his accounts, read private correspondence, trying to find even the slightest hint of his new relationship. It became a kind of obsession for her, absorbing all her thoughts and actions. Once Travis, seemingly jokingly but with a note of anxiety, said to his friend, "Don't be surprised if one day you find me dead." Perhaps deep down, he already felt that Jodi's obsession could have fatal consequences. I can say that such jokes are often a kind of cry for help. People who find themselves in toxic and dangerous relationships sometimes unconsciously send signals to others, hoping that someone will intervene and save them from the threat. But at that moment, neither Travis himself nor his friends gave proper significance to this joke. They attributed it to Jodi's eccentricity and did not perceive her behavior as a real danger. Months passed and Jodi's obsession only intensified. She gave Travis no peace, stalked him, threw tantrums and caused scandals. Eventually, at the end of May 2008, tired of her endless antics, Travis gave Jodi an ultimatum. Either she leaves his life forever or he will be forced to take radical measures. But was Jodi ready to let go of her obsession so easily? Could she come to terms with the idea that Travis would never belong to her again? The answers to these questions will sound right now because at that point, all the alarm bells were ringing at full force, foreshadowing the tragic denouement of this story. At the beginning of 2008, Travis had grand plans. He organized a business trip to Mexico, which was to take place on June 15th. And interestingly, he initially planned this trip together with Jodi. It would seem to be an ideal opportunity for lovers to spend time together, combining work and leisure under the scorching Mexican sun. But in April, the situation changed dramatically. Travis suddenly informed Jodi that the plans had changed, and instead of her, he had decided to take another girl with him. We can only imagine what a blow this was for Jodi, who had already managed to paint a perfect picture of their joint trip in her imagination. And so, the night of June 2nd arrived. Around 2 o'clock, Jodi, unable to bear the tension, began calling Travis. She dialed his number 4 times in a row, but he stubbornly did not answer. Perhaps he already felt then that a conversation with Jodi would not bring anything good and tried to avoid conflict. The longest call lasted only 17 seconds. Imagine this picture. Jodi engulfed in jealousy and anger, pressing the call button again and again, and Travis, tired of her intrusiveness, simply looking at the phone screen, not daring to answer. But Jodi did not give up. She kept calling, and eventually Travis couldn't stand it. He answered her call, and they talked for 18 minutes at first, and then for another 41 minutes. One can only guess what they were talking about and how tense this conversation was. The last conversation between them lasted 2 minutes and 48 seconds. What was said in those nearly 3 minutes? Did Jodi try to convince Travis to change his plans one last time? Or maybe she was already threatening him with reprisals. Unfortunately, we will never know for sure. I have seen many similar cases. When one person obsessively pursues another, giving them no peace day or night, it can drive even the most resilient personality to despair. And unfortunately, such situations often end in tragedy. So we have every reason to assume that these nightly calls from Jodi became a kind of point of no return in her relationship with Travis. She could not come to terms with his decision to take another girl with him on the trip and was ready to do anything to hinder these plans. And Travis, in turn, was already tired of her constant tantrums and scandals and sought to break this toxic bond as soon as possible. After that fateful phone conversation with Travis, Jodi decided to act. She rented a car, intending to make a long trip to the state of Utah. At first, her path led through Southern California, where she visited her friends at a work conference. It would seem to be an ordinary stop along the way, but as it turned out later, it had far-reaching consequences. During her stay in California, Jodi met with Ryan Burns, Travis' colleague, and it was from him that we learned several interesting details. It turns out that at the time of the meeting with Burns, Jodi's blonde hair had already been dyed dark chestnut. Moreover, Burns noticed cuts on her hands. A strange change of image and injuries, don't you think? It seems that Jodi was preparing for something important and tried to disguise her appearance. On June 6th, Jodi left California for Utah, stopping by the city of Alta along the way. All this time, she tried to contact Travis, leaving him numerous voice messages. Her obsession reached such a level that she even managed to gain access to the voicemail system of his mobile phone. One can only guess what words she left in those messages and whether they contained threats against Travis. When returning the rented car, Jodi had to explain a few strange things. First, according to the seller, the car managed to accumulate about 3,000 miles in a short period of time. Second, the rental clerk noticed the absence of floor mats in the cabin and the presence of suspicious red stains on the seats. However, unfortunately, these stains were never thoroughly investigated, as the company rushed to clean the car before the police examined it. As an experienced detective, I cannot help but note that all these details raise serious suspicions. Why did Jodi need to change her appearance so drastically? Why were there cuts on her hands? And most importantly, what were the mysterious red stains found in the car she rented? All these questions suggest that something sinister is hiding behind Jodi's outward decency. Of course, at that moment, no one could have predicted what tragic events this seemingly ordinary trip would lead to. But from the height of the years lived and taking into account all the circumstances of the case, we can say with confidence that it was during that period that Jodi embarked on a dark path from which there was no turning back. So let's set aside these alarming details for now and move a few days forward, when Travis' friends sounded the alarm, unable to contact him. It was their persistence and concern that led to the terrible discovery that forever changed the course of this story. On June 9th, Travis' friends sounded the alarm. They had not been able to contact him for several days, which was extremely unusual for such a communicative person. Even his roommates had not seen Travis during this time, simply thinking that he had gone somewhere on business. But the friends' concern grew with each passing hour, and they decided to visit his home to check if everything was all right. What they saw upon entering Travis' apartment was forever etched in their memory. There was a huge pool of blood on the floor, and Travis' body itself lay in the shower. It is hard to even imagine the shock and horror that gripped his friends at that moment. Without wasting a second, they called 911, summoning emergency services. The dispatcher, taking the call, asked standard questions. One of them concerned whether Travis was prone to suicide. Of course, his friends rejected such a possibility. They knew Travis as a cheerful and positive person who would never take such a step. Another question was more alarming. Was there anyone from Travis' circle who might wish him harm? And then Travis' friends remembered Jodi Arias, Travis' ex-girlfriend. They said that she literally stalked him, was wildly jealous, and even resorted to such extremes as hacking his Facebook page and damaging the tires of his car. It seemed that Jodi was obsessed with Travis and could not come to terms with the fact that he had left her. As a detective with many years of experience, I immediately realized that this information could be key to the investigation. Obsession and aggressive behavior of former partners often lead to tragic consequences. And although at that moment it was still too early to draw final conclusions, Jodi Arias automatically fell into the list of main suspects. Of course, investigators could not rule out other versions. Perhaps Travis had some enemies that even his closest friends did not know about. Or it could have been an ordinary robbery gone wrong. But with each new detail, with each new fact that surfaced during the investigation, the arrow of suspicion increasingly pointed towards Jodi. Now the cops needed to act quickly and in a coordinated manner. Interrogate all possible witnesses, gather evidence, track the movements of suspects. Every minute was worth its weight in gold because the killer was still at large and could strike again at any moment. When the detectives arrived at the crime scene and began a thorough search of Travis' apartment, one of the first finds made us shudder. A camera was found in the washing machine. At first glance, nothing strange nowadays. Many people have digital cameras. But during further investigation, it turned out that this camera had been purchased quite recently. And most importantly, it was damaged. Such details immediately made us wary. Later, technical experts set about restoring the data from the camera, and what they found came as a real shock. In the recovered images, we saw Jodi Arias and Travis in rather intimate poses. The pictures were dated June 4th around 2 p.m. It turns out that on that day, Jodi was in Travis' apartment, and more than just a friendly meeting was taking place between them. But the most shocking thing was that the camera contained photographs of Travis immediately before the murder, during it, and even after. It was like some kind of eerie photo report taken by the killer himself. The last photo in which Travis was still alive was taken at 5:29 p.m. on the same day, and literally a few minutes later, the camera captured bloody scenes in his bathroom. In these terrible pictures, one could make out the silhouette of a person, probably Travis, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. The red liquid spread across the floor, creating eerie patterns, and on the wall of the corridor leading to the bathroom, a bloody handprint was clearly visible. Later, the examination showed that the print contained mixed DNA of both Jodi and Travis. In fact, investigators obtained irrefutable evidence that Jodi Arias was present at the crime scene at the time of Travis' murder. Her intimate photos with the victim and taken just a few hours before his death, as well as her handprints at the crime scene, all this spoke in favor of the fact that she was the main suspect. It was necessary to carefully analyze each photograph. each detail in order to reconstruct an accurate picture of the events of that fatal day. But even then, we felt that we had taken a huge step towards solving this horrific crime. Now law enforcement had not just the testimony of friends about Jodi's obsession and aggressive behavior. In their hands were photographs that irrefutably proved her involvement in the murder, and although there was still a lot of work ahead of us, we were filled with determination to see the case through to the end and bring the perpetrators to justice. Only one question remained: why? What could have pushed a young woman to commit such a terrible crime? Love, jealousy, hatred. Or maybe there was something more behind this, something we did not yet understand. Believe me, what happened next just shocked me. July 15, 2008 became a decisive day in this case. It was then, based on the evidence gathered, that Jodi Arias was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. What happened next can boldly be called a theater of the absurd. At first, Jodi completely denied her presence in the city on the day of the crime. She claimed that the last time she saw Travis was back in March of that year. Imagine the shock we felt upon hearing such outright lies. After all, we had irrefutable evidence in our hands that it was on June 4th that Jodi was in Travis' apartment, and not just there, but had an intimate relationship with him. But the most impressive thing was that Jodi managed to stick to this false version for a whole 2 years. Only after such a long time, realizing perhaps that her position did not stand up to any criticism, she suddenly changed her testimony. Now she claimed that she was indeed in Travis' apartment on the night of the murder, but only because he himself had called her. Eventually, in March 2013, after long weeks of trial, Jodi Arias was found guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. The jury could not come to a unanimous decision on the death penalty, so Jodi was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, this woman continued to amaze with her behavior. During interrogations, she could suddenly start singing, laughing, talking to herself, or even doing a handstand. It was so strange and inappropriate that even seasoned guards could not contain their surprise. But perhaps the most shocking thing for me was the fact that Jodi attended Travis' memorial service. She came there, although she knew for sure that everyone suspected her of this terrible murder. And the whole time, while Travis' friends and relatives were mourning his death, Jodi sat with a stone face. She did not shed a single tear, did not show any sympathy. It seemed that she was not at all worried about the grief of other people. Now Jodi Arias is serving her sentence in the Arizona State Prison Complex. And even there, she manages to be in the spotlight. Recently, in one interview, she said that she receives a lot of love from fans behind bars. "There is so much love in my direction that I can't even respond to it now," she said with a smile. In April 2019, Jodi filed an appeal against her sentence, claiming that she did not receive a fair trial. But on March 24, 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals upheld the verdict without changes. Thus ended one of the loudest and most scandalous criminal cases in US history. On May 13, 2015, around 5 p.m., firefighters extinguished a raging fire in a garage by the roadside in the village of Sand Lake, Michigan. At that moment, a frightened woman ran up to their vehicle, shouting that her neighbors were dead. Several firefighters hurried with the woman to her neighbor's house. In the bedroom, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, were 2 lifeless bodies. It appeared that they had been shot. To preserve the evidence of the crime scene, the firefighters refrained from touching anything and immediately informed the police that they had found 2 bodies and required investigators and forensic experts. Forensic experts had been working at the crime scene for about an hour, collecting evidence and photographing the bodies of 46-year-old Martin Durham and 47-year-old Glenna Durham when one officer noticed a slight movement in Glenna's chest. Just a tiny bit. He rushed to her body and tried to feel for a pulse. But before he could touch her, Glenna's eyes opened wide, and she sat up abruptly, screaming, "What are you doing, Marty?" The officer immediately called for paramedics, who transported the injured woman to the local hospital. Marty and Glenna first met as teenagers in the early 1980s. Marty invited the girl on a date to a local open-air theater, where they lost their virginity on the very same evening, with little interest in the movie itself. Their relationship progressed quickly and passionately, but they broke up after a few months, partly because 17-year-old Glenna was married. Soon Marty started a family of his own. Christina Keller was 14 years old when she met 19-year-old Marty at a party held at his house. The young man seemed charming and fun to the girl, but also a little strange because he immediately declared that he would marry her someday. The next day, Marty showed up at her doorstep. Apparently, he made a favorable impression on Christina's parents because after that, he never left her life. Their friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and soon 16-year-old Christina discovered that she was expecting their first child. Within 2 years, she was carrying their second son, which prompted the young couple to get married. 11 months later, Christina gave her husband a daughter. Christina was 19 and Marty was 24 at the time. Initially, the young family lived with relatives, but in early 1995, Marty obtained a higher-paying job at a factory in Michigan, and the family of 5 moved there. However, on the evening of February 16, 1995, while returning from work, Marty was involved in a car accident. Another vehicle, speeding through a red light, collided with his car. The larger vehicle practically crushed Marty's car, trapping him inside. Marty was taken to the hospital, where he was in a clinically dead state for about 5 minutes. The left side of his body suffered severe injuries, and he remained in a coma for over 3 weeks. When he finally regained consciousness, he had no recollection of his wife, children, or much of his past life. He spent a year and a half learning to walk, speak, eat, and take care of himself again. Throughout this time, Christina supported him. Physically, Marty increasingly resembled his former self, but psychologically, he had changed. Due to the brain trauma, he experienced bouts of rage. He never raised his hand against his wife and children but became a domineering person. Even his sense of humor became darker. In 2000, almost 5 years after the accident, Christina filed for divorce. She still cared deeply for her husband, but her feelings had transformed into more of a maternal nature, as she took on the role of his caregiver and could no longer relate to him in any other way. In May 2001, Marty purchased his first home using the funds he received from the insurance company, along with a bank loan. The house was located in the small village of Sand Lake, Michigan, where only 500 people reside. Marty was incredibly proud of his new home, where he moved in with his 2 sons and an African gray parrot named Bud. 2 months after moving into the house, Marty was surprised by a knock on his door from a 16-year-old girl who claimed to be his daughter. Marty asked who her mother was, and it turned out to be Glenna, his first love. The girl knew that her mother had had an affair early in her marriage, and she was born a few months later. She wanted to establish her paternity for certain. A DNA test confirmed that the girl was indeed Marty's biological daughter, born out of wedlock. This revelation led to the rekindling of Marty and Glenna's relationship, despite Glenna still being married. Clearly, Glenna had never been able to forget Marty, as she had a tattoo with his name on her arm throughout her marriage. Glenna divorced her husband and moved in with Marty. They were very happy together and soon had a new wedding ceremony. Glenna's new husband meant everything to her. The couple spent all their time together, visiting family, and going to the local casino once or twice a week. Even when Marty went hunting, Glenna would sit in the car and read a novel. Officially taking on the responsibility of caring for her husband, Glenna received $3,200 per month for her services. Marty's disability benefits amounted to over $1,000 per month. Additionally, Glenna sold excess medication from Marty, so their monthly income was approximately $5,000. When Marty's sons moved out, this income was sufficient for their life in the small village. However, by 2010, Marty's health, both mental and physical, had deteriorated significantly. The couple continued to spend all their time together and with their friends, including Connie and Keith Ream, another neighboring couple. On Monday, May 11, 2015, Marty offered to mow the lawn in Connie and Keith's backyard. He enjoyed doing this work and did it completely free of charge. Later that evening, all 4 of them, Connie, Keith, Marty, and Glenna, sat on the neighbor's terrace, and the Durhams returned home around 9 p.m. The next day, On Tuesday at 8:26 a.m., Keith sent Marty a message asking how he was feeling, but he didn't receive a response. This was strange because Marty always promptly answered calls and messages. Throughout the day, Keith sent several more messages to his friend with the same result. Later that day, Connie approached the neighbor's door and knocked. She heard the Shelby family's dog barking, but no one opened the door. Keith even sent a joking message to Glenna saying, "What did you do to Marty?" Of course, she didn't respond to him either. On Wednesday, at 7:30 a.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house again and rang the doorbell. The only response she received was the dog barking. She walked around the house, checking if any doors or windows were open. Everything was locked as usual. Throughout the day, Connie and Keith tried to contact their neighbors, becoming increasingly worried. After work, around 4:30 p.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house for the third time and knocked. She was sure she would have to break the door, but to her surprise, when she touched the handle, she discovered that the door was not locked this time. Connie cautiously opened the door and called out for the neighbors. But at the door, she was only met by the Shelby family pet, who led her into the living room where there was a gruesome mess. Documents and photographs were scattered everywhere, a broken lamp and other items were in disarray. Following Shelby into the bedroom, Connie found the homeowners lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Marty was only in his underwear, while Glenna was fully dressed, with her legs covered by a blanket. Connie rushed out of the neighbor's house and ran towards a fire truck she noticed further down the road. Marty was not as lucky as his wife. 5 bullets that hit his back, forearm, and chest left him no chance of survival. He had been dead for several days. Glenna was shot twice, with both shots hitting the area behind her right ear. Blood was found not only in the bedroom, but also on the chair in the living room and on a pillow with 2 bullet holes. Underneath the chair, a gun and 2 empty shells were found. In the bedroom, there were 5 more shell casings, 1 near the door and 4 near Marty's body, totaling 7 in total. However, the gun found near the chair was designed for 6 bullets. This means that the perpetrator found time to reload the gun before continuing the shooting. Apart from the living room and bedroom, the rooms in the house appeared completely normal. There were no signs of forced entry, and in the kitchen, there was a bowl of spaghetti and a piece of garlic bread on the table. Later that same evening, when Glenna was taken to the hospital, Marty's children were allowed to take the family pets, a dog and a parrot, and bring them to their mother's house, Christina. Although the children were only permitted to take the pets, the trio did not miss the opportunity to search the house and discovered a sealed envelope with the word personal written on it. Inside, they found letters from Glenna addressed to her children and ex-husband. In the letters, she expressed her love for the children and asked for their forgiveness for not being the best mother. She also asked her ex-husband to take care of the children. Additionally, in Glenna's drawer, they found a packet of unpaid bills. They handed over all the findings to the police. The investigators began questioning the family's relatives and friends about their relationships and financial situation. They loved spending time together and were truly absorbed in each other's company. However, it soon became clear that they were facing serious financial difficulties. Glenna was in charge of the family's accounts, and relatives believed that Marty was unaware of the severity of their situation because he was quite frugal. On the other hand, Glenna had developed a serious addiction to gambling. She would spend hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets and lose thousands of dollars at the casino. But whenever her husband approached her, she would pretend to be playing with $1 bills. She played every week, and in 2010 alone, Glenna spent $75,000 on her addiction. The family had fallen behind on tax payments, had credit card debt, and Marty's car was on the verge of being repossessed. However, the most pressing issue was their home. Glenna hadn't made mortgage payments for over a year, and they had accumulated a debt of $48,000. In early April 2015, A few weeks before the attack on the family, Marty's mother saw a list of homes that would be seized due to debts, and Marty's address was listed there. She called Glenna, who assured her that the newspaper had printed the wrong address and that she would sort it out. Of course, it turned out that their home was indeed being taken away. Despite the fact that Marty had taken out the mortgage, on April 28th, Glenna received a notice that their home would be auctioned if they didn't pay $5,000. Interestingly, the auction was scheduled for May 12th, just a day before Marty and Glenna were found by their neighbor. The investigators concluded that Marty was unaware of the impending loss of their home because he had been renovating it for the past 2 months. Just 2 days before their deaths, he had painted the bathroom. After 3 days in the intensive care unit, Glenna regained consciousness. She had no recollection of the day of the murders or the preceding days. She couldn't even remember writing the letters to her children and ex-husband. Since the eyewitness couldn't provide any helpful information, the police had few leads or clues to work with. The weapon contained multiple DNA samples, as Marty was an avid hunter and often showed his firearms to friends. However, Glenna and Marty also sold drugs, for which they received cash payments, and large sums of money were stored in envelopes in a safe. Could this have been an unplanned robbery? The living room was in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something, and the cash from the safe was indeed missing. This version of events seemed the most plausible, but finding the killer among the clients of their illegal activities was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A whole year passed before an unexpected witness helped solve the case. It was a 19-year-old parrot named Bud, who had been living with Christina for the past 12 months. Bud was an African grey parrot and had the unique ability of not only mimicking sounds and words he heard in his environment but also imitating human voices. Originally, he was Christina's beloved pet, but Marty took him, presumably as a way to get back at his ex-wife for leaving him. Upon returning to his beloved owner, Bud started reproducing various conversations he had heard while living with Marty, such as how Marty played with the dog. But at some point, he began repeating an argument between a man and a woman. They were clearly arguing with each other, raising their voices and occasionally mixing profanity with regular words, and at the end of the dialogue, a male voice shouted clearly, "No, no, don't shoot." Christina recorded this scene performed by the parrot on video but didn't report it to the police, thinking it would be laughed off. However, when a local journalist interviewed Marty's mother a year after his murder, she mentioned the video. The journalist became very interested and aired it on the news. The video quickly went viral, and the increased public attention forced the police to reopen the case and focus their attention on one suspect, Glenna Durham. They examined Marty and Glenna's phones and discovered that the last thing Marty did on his phone was search for information about lawnmowers on the evening of the 11th, after they returned home from the neighbors. The examination of Glenna's phone turned out to be much more intriguing. It had been used until the 13th, the day the bodies were found. From 3:32 a.m. to 4:48 a.m., someone used the phone 5 times to find information about the gun used in the shootings, including how to reload it. The last message was sent to Glenna's mother at 4:48 a.m. and said, "I love you, forgive me." Glenna was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She insisted on her innocence, and her lawyer tried to prove that another family member or a stranger had broken into the house to steal medication, cash, or Marty's weapons. However, the forensic experts did not find any signs of forced entry into the house. And what about the money from the safe? It turned out that Marty's children had taken it while they were searching the house when Glenna was taken to the hospital and their father to the morgue. When investigators accidentally learned about this, they stated that nobody had asked them about the money at the police station, so they didn't say anything. In any case, the version of a robber was discarded because nothing was stolen. The prosecution's version of events painted a much more plausible picture. Here's what they believed happened. Since Marty was in his underwear, he could have been killed on the morning of the 12th. The man must have learned about the inevitable loss of the house, became very upset, and a heated argument ensued. When Glenna grabbed the weapon, Marty turned and tried to run into the bedroom. She shot him in the back. Marty was still on his feet, reaching for another weapon in the bedside table. Glenna fired again, hitting his forearm. Only then did he turn to face her, and she sent 3 more bullets into his chest. Marty fell lifeless on the bedroom floor. Glenna spent the whole day doing paperwork. She wrote letters to her ex-husband and children and prepared spaghetti for lunch. When the neighbor showed up at her house for the first time on the evening of the 12th, Glenna was still engaged in these activities. Understanding that the neighbors would start to worry about her and Marty, no matter what Glenna planned, she needed to act quickly. She settled into a chair in the living room, placed a pillow against her head, and fired. However, nothing happened. The pillow absorbed the force of the shot, and the bullet barely grazed her. Since it was the last bullet in the pistol, she had to look up online how to reload it. This means she did not attempt it again until the early morning of the 13th when she sent a message to her mother. Perhaps she still had doubts when Connie knocked on the door again at 7:30 a.m. because the door was still locked. But when Connie left, Glenna must have unlocked the door, sat in the chair, took the pillow, and tried again. This time the injury turned out to be more serious, but as her doctor later explained, she did not hit any important veins, arteries, or penetrate the skull. It's hard to imagine what state she was in, but since head wounds always bleed profusely, she may have decided that she would simply bleed out. She made her way to the bedroom, where her husband's body had been lying all this time, and collapsed on the floor, covering her legs with a blanket. Whether she staged the scene when the police officer touched her or only regained consciousness at that moment is unknown, and we may never know because Glenna continues to claim memory loss. The jury believed the prosecution's version. On Wednesday, July 19, 2017, after 9 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. Glenna Durham was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of course, the parrot named Bader was not invited to court as a witness, and it's not because he swears terribly. It's simply impossible to prove that he didn't hear that particular dialogue on a TV show or the radio, not to mention how he could take an oath in the witness stand. In other words, if Bader had participated in the process and less than 24 hours had passed since Glenna's guilty verdict, her lawyer would have filed an appeal. Toulouse, February 27, 1989. 21-year-old Valerie Tarot was found dead in her home. The scene that unfolded before the eyes of the police was shocking in its cruelty. Valerie lay on the bed, wearing a bathrobe, her wrists bound with a shoelace, a scarf in her mouth as a gag. It was soaked in blood that had flowed from her throat. The room floor was covered with the torn underwear of the girl, ripped in half. One obvious injury on her body was a strangulation mark on her neck. The autopsy provided even more food for thought for the police. 2 scarves were found deep in Valerie's throat, and the results of the toxicological examination showed that she had been under the influence of some substances. There were so many of them that they alone could have caused her death. Furthermore, a few days earlier, a building worker in which the girl lived found Valerie's backpack in the trash. Inside were her documents, an ashtray, cigarette butts, a glass, shoes, keys to the apartment, and a blood-stained bedside lamp. Gathering all this information, the investigators concluded that the girl had voluntarily left this life. The case was closed. Of course, such a conclusion did not satisfy Valerie's relatives. who tried unsuccessfully to persuade the police to investigate the case as a murder. 11 months later, hikers on the trail to Fenway found a wallet and documents belonging to a girl named Laura Martin. On the same day, in a canal approximately 20 kilometers away in Bon Repos Riquet, they discovered the lifeless body of a 19-year-old girl. She was completely naked, except for her socks. It was indeed Laura, who had been missing for 2 days. The autopsy revealed that the girl died from strangulation. However, prior to her death, she had been sexually assaulted anally and vaginally with an object, apparently a baseball bat. Additionally, the forensic expert found a torn spleen, indicating a very strong blow to the abdomen, such as a kick. The police began an investigation that the investigators did not come across any significant leads, and of course, it never occurred to anyone to establish a connection between the two cases. 7 years passed, and it was the morning of February 11, 1997. At 9 o'clock in the morning, firefighters entered an apartment in a multi-story building located on the 4th floor in Toulouse. Inside, they discovered the lifeless and charred body of a 29-year-old woman named Martin Matthias. Martin was lying face down on the bed. On the floor, there was a magazine from an automatic pistol, and in the bathroom, there was a blood-stained and torn bra. The bathtub and the carpet was stained with blood, and there was also a light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed. The firefighters concluded that there were 2 points of fire, 2 clear attempts of deliberate arson in the bedroom and in the living room near the armchair. The police inspector in charge of the investigation combined all these pieces of evidence and concluded that Martin's death occurred as a result of a decision made by Martin herself. 10 days later, on February 22, 1997, 21-year-old Emily Isps entered a bar in Toulouse. It was the afternoon, and she wanted to have a drink with her friends. In the bar, she met a pleasant and attractive guy named Patrice. Patrice had his own way of attracting girls because he distributed prohibited substances to Emily and her friends. Patrice and Emily spent the remaining part of the day and the following morning together. In the evening, the young man planned to go to a concert and invited Emily to join him. She accepted his invitation. However, before the concert, they met up with Patrice's friend, Eve, with whom he had been living for some time. The group of young people had dinner together and had some drinks. Then Patrice and Emily got into Patrice's car and headed to the concert, which they arrived at around 1:30 a.m. Emily danced a lot, while Patrice spent more time at the bar drinking beer. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Emily, feeling tired as she hadn't slept for 2 days, asked her new acquaintance to drive her home. The exhausted girl hadn't even had a chance to sit in the car when she immediately fell asleep. When she woke up, it seemed to her that only a moment had passed, but she was already lying on the back seat of the car. Opening her eyes, Emily was astonished to see Patrice above her with bulging eyes, choking her. He no longer resembled the pleasant guy she had spent the whole day with. Emily couldn't understand how someone could spend an entire day with such a nice guy and then, within a minute, he turned into a monster who was now strangling her. Emily tried to resist. She screamed, scratched Patrice, and tried to tear his hair. He ordered her to shut up and struck her face several times, after which Emily lost consciousness. A few minutes later, she woke up without her panties. He must have tried to violate her. Emily thought that she probably wouldn't survive and decided to pretend to be dead or talk to him. She chose to talk to Patrice, trying to remain calm and relieve tension. She repeated that she understood everything, that such things happen when someone drinks too much, that everything was fine, and she wouldn't tell anyone anything. Patrice stopped the car and asked her to please him. Emily refused. Then he moved to the back seat with her, continued undressing her, and violated her again. Emily did her best to stay calm. She continued talking to him, minimizing the harm he had caused her. Suddenly, Patrice burst into tears and said he regretted what he had done. He said to Emily, "You hold 10 years of my life in your hands." Emily didn't think he was such a great actor, so he must have been sincere. Hope arose within her again. Emily calms down her assailant and
Tormentor. She speaks to him softly because her only thought is to get out of this nightmare alive. She managed to calm Patrice down, and she asked him to drive her home. He refused, so they went to Eve, a friend where Patrice was staying. They lay down to sleep together in one bed, but Patrice didn't touch Emily anymore.
expectation set in. Emily went through hell, but she's alive. She knew that it was in the neighboring room, so she felt slightly safer, despite the fact that the attacker was sleeping just a few centimeters away from her. The girl managed to doze off for a few hours until she heard Eve and his girlfriend wake up. Emily got up and found them in the kitchen. Even Nora, his girlfriend, were horrified when they saw bruises on Emily's face. She explained to them that she was attacked by a guy at the concert. She didn't see his face because it was covered by a hood. Emily lied, protecting Patrice, but mainly to protect herself. After all, she was still in a state of shock and deeply shaken. Perhaps she wasn't fully aware of what was happening, as if her soul had detached from her body. This is a common defense mechanism for people who have experienced trauma. It quietly took her aside and asked if Patrice had anything to do with it, because even though Patrice was staying with him, Eve knew that his ex-girlfriend had kicked him out after a major argument, and Eve didn't fully trust him. Nora insists that Patrice had nothing to do with it, that it was a guy from the concert. Patrice woke up and also went to the kitchen. He confirmed Emily's story. Yes, it was a guy in a hood. Unfortunately, there was no chance of catching him. In any case, Nora drove Emily to the hospital. Doctors found signs of strangulation on the girl's neck. Additionally, she had several injuries on her face. She would have to spend a few days in the hospital under medical observation. In the hospital, Emily finally felt safer. She decided to tell the truth about what really happened, that Patrice attacked her. However, he suspected that Emily might confess everything, so he had already disappeared. Now, after one of Patrice's victims survived, the police finally start searching for him. He will be on the run for 3 months. On June 14, 1997, at a rural festival, Patrice, who now calls himself Frank, met Murray Norman. Murray, 35 years old, lived in a chalet in a small town below Foix. Murray felt sorry for the young man who complained about having nowhere to stay and offered him to live with her in exchange for doing some housework. Besides, on the 20th, Murray planned to visit her parents and decided that Frank would take care of the house. That's how Murray and Frank lived together for several days. During the day, he worked in the garden, fixed things, and in the evening, they had dinner together, talked, and smoked. On June 19th, Murray and Frank had a great time. Murray got a new job at a wolf sanctuary in Oulu, so she arranged a celebratory dinner. They drank a lot and smoked cannabis. Obviously, both of them were in uplifted mood, and Frank, that is, Patrice, tried to kiss Murray. But she clearly wasn't ready for it and went into the bedroom, trying to avoid an unpleasant situation. However, the man followed her into the room, grabbed her by the head, and hit her against the wall. Murray felt dizzy, but she managed to break free from his grasp. Then Patrice picked up a chair and hit his victim, who had fallen unconscious on the bed. He brutally assaulted her several times. When this brought her back to consciousness, he started choking her with his bare hands, but when he released her throat, Murray was still breathing. Then Patrice tied her ankles and wrists and gagged her. After doing all this, he took Murray's body to the first floor and began cleaning up to remove all traces of blood. He painted the blue carpet with blue paint to conceal the blood stains. He used an angle grinder to remove the top layer of wooden furniture that had blood stains on it. The killer burned Murray's sheets and clothes in the garden and washed his own in the washing machine. Then he wrapped the victim's body in a blanket, dug a hole in the garden, and buried Murray in her own garden the following evening. Before leaving the chalet, he stole 5,000 francs in cash and some valuable items that could be sold, including the angled grinder. And in an attempt to divert suspicion from himself, he left a note on the table. Murray, I don't know where you are. I finished my work and I'm leaving. On June 20th, 1997, Patrice was driving Mireille's car and heading to Spain. It was also his 29th birthday. A few days later, Patrice was already in Alicante, in the south of Spain. There he met two French girls, Isabelle and Valerie. The young people quickly became friends and spent several days together, sunbathing on the beach, having meals together, and going for walks. Then the girls' vacation ended, and it was time for them to return to Paris. They promised to meet again someday and exchanged phone numbers. If only they knew. Patrice continued his journey, visiting Germany and Belgium, before arriving in Paris on September 1st, 1997. Of course, he called Isabelle and Valerie, and that same evening they agreed to have dinner together at a restaurant. The girls were happy to see their new friend again, but Patrice explained his situation to them. His car and all his money had been stolen. He was quite skilled at portraying himself as a victim. He asked the girls if one of them could let him stay with them for 2 days before his departure. Valerie couldn't accommodate him as she was leaving for a business trip the next day, but Isabelle allowed him to spend the night on her sofa, with the condition that it wouldn't exceed 4 days. On September 4th, 1997, the residents of the same apartment building where 31-year-old Isabelle Chicheri lived woke up to a loud explosion. It turned out that the explosion followed a fire that had started in the girl's apartment. Her partially burned body was found lying on the bed. The gas burners in the kitchen were turned on, and the fire broke out near the bathroom. It was evident that Isabelle's death was not accidental. The front door was not forced open, and there were 3 glasses, a bottle of pink wine, and champagne on the table. The wounds on the victim's body indicated the incredible cruelty of the killer. There was blood in the toilet, and blood was flowing from her mouth, nose, and anus. However, no trace of semen was found on Isabelle's body. Instead, a blood-stained carrot was found near the mattress. The autopsy would confirm that the perpetrator tortured the girl with it. Moreover, she had been severely beaten. The blows were inflicted all over her body, but mainly on her face. Asphyxiation was the cause of death. When investigators learned that Isabelle had sheltered a man named Patrice, they immediately paid attention to this detail because the police had been searching for a certain Patrice for some time. And it was all thanks to the testimony of Emily Espy, who managed to survive Patrice Allegre's attack at the end of February. Then, after the disappearance of Mireille Norman, her relatives, who were expecting her as a guest, became worried. However, it took 3 weeks before her body was found tied up and buried in the garden. But after the discovery of the body, the gendarmes' suspicions were closely linked to Patrice. Because although he presented himself under a false name, many witnesses had seen his face and recognized him from the pictures presented by the investigators. When he returned to Paris in early September, he was already actively being sought. The search warrant for him circulated throughout France. The police contacted his relatives and friends and promised a reward for assistance in his capture. And then Patrice contacted a friend and asked if he could stay overnight in Paris. That's when the investigators saw an opportunity to apprehend him. They asked this man to call Patrice back and direct him to an ideal location for capture in Châtenay-Malabry. On September 5, 1997, at 5:10 p.m., Patrice entered the house where the police were already hiding. He didn't resist arrest. According to some witnesses, he even seemed relieved to be arrested, as if he were tired of hiding. Surprisingly, the arrest of the serial killer did not attract much attention from the public. Perhaps it was because the media did not report that a serial killer was on the run, as the investigators initially could not establish a connection between the different cases. But it was also because another tragedy dominated the headlines: the car accident and the death of Princess Diana in Paris on August 31, 1997. As a result, Patrice's arrest did not receive much attention. It didn't make big headlines. When he was interrogated, Patrice willingly cooperated. He confessed to his crimes and described them in detail. It was horrifying because he described them in the present tense, as if reliving them but with a completely detached expression. Patrice was arrested for the attack on Emily Espy and the murders of Mireille Norman and Isabelle Chicheri. However, when Patrice talked about Mireille Norman, the girl who allowed him to stay in her chalet in exchange for work in the garden, he referred to her by a different name. He called her Martin, which made the investigators wonder. Gradually, they began to realize that he was confusing her with another one of his victims. Knowing Patrice's affinity for elements of luxury life, investigators offer him champagne, oysters, foie gras, and more outdoor walks in exchange for him revealing information about his other victims. And indeed, after this, Patrice confessed to killing 3 more women: Martin Mathias, Laure Martine, and Valerie Theriot. Only after the puzzle pieces started coming together as evidence, already known to the detectives. As it is already known, in the cases of Martin Mathias and Valerie Theriot, investigators concluded that they had taken their own lives. However, it turned out that Patrice personally knew all the women. Valerie Theriot was his colleague. They both worked as waiters at the same cafe in Toulouse. Laure Martine lived with him in the same region of Toulouse, so she got into his car because she recognized him. As for Martin Mathias, she was Patrice's neighbor. They lived in apartments opposite each other. In other words, from the very beginning, many clues pointed to Patrice Allegre as a possible suspect, but investigators did not notice them for a long time. It was unusual for a serial killer. Patrice knew all his victims personally, even if sometimes only for a couple of days, as in the case of Emily, but he always followed the same script. We spend time together, go out, become friends, and then an attack follows. Although Patrice assisted the investigation during interrogations and quickly confessed to the killings, investigators and later psychiatrists noticed that when it came to discussing the murders, he found it much more difficult to provide explanations. Each time, his version of events sounded like this: he tried to kiss the victim, she refused, he became enraged and strangled her. In some cases he used objects to assault the victims, but the man himself insisted that he did everything alone. This indicates that his version of the murders and attacks does not correspond to reality. Is it a lie, or does he remember the events poorly? It's hard to say, but in any case, it casts doubt on his confession. For example, let's consider the case of Martin Mathias. Patrice recalls how he met her at McDonald's in early February 1997. He asked if he could sit at her table, and they started talking, finding a common topic in boxing. Martin Mathias was the boxing champion of France, and Patrice had practiced it in the past. According to Patrice, Martin agreed to meet him again and invited him to have a drink at her place a few days later, and it was during this meeting that everything went wrong. However, the autopsy doesn't fully support this version. Toxicological analysis revealed alcohol and chloroform in her system, even though she didn't drink, and there was a mark of an electric shock in the intimate area of her body. As you may recall, a light bulb was unscrewed in the apartment and something was done to the electrical wiring. This leads to the speculation that the girl did not invite Patrice to her place, but he stalked her because he lived across the street. Then he incapacitated her because under normal circumstances, Martin Mathias was stronger than him. Of course, there are no facts that definitively confirm this, but it is important to note that there are discrepancies between the story told by the killer and the evidence. And this implies that he is not striving to be completely honest with the investigation. Moreover, he spoke eagerly and extensively about his childhood. Patrice was born on June 20th in Toulouse. His mother, Michelle, was a hairdresser and became pregnant with a boy at the age of 17. His father, Roland, was 4 years older than her and worked as a police officer. Patrice always knew that he was an unwanted child. 7 years later, Michelle and Roland had their second son, a desired child. Patrice's childhood could not be called happy. His parents often argued, and his father would physically abuse his mother. Patrice tried to intervene, but he only ended up getting beaten himself. Roland, being a police officer, was often absent from home, paying little attention to his son. Patrice's mother, on the other hand, showed little affection towards him. However, she was an alcoholic, and when Patrice was young, she fell into an alcoholic coma right in front of him in her beauty salon. She was also unfaithful to her husband and constantly cheated on him. Patrice became a witness to some of her intimate encounters as well as the reconciliations between Michelle and Roland after fights. Often, when he tried to sleep in his room, he would hear his mother's moans from the adjacent room and would cover his head with a pillow, trying to drown out those sounds. Another time, she derived pleasure from one of her friends in the car while 6-year-old Patrice sat in the back seat and saw everything. Despite all this, Patrice despised his father and idealized his mother. He would defend her and couldn't stand it when people spoke ill of her. He had difficulty studying in school, and he had to repeat a year several times. He would skip classes, and his mother allowed him to do so. During this time, he began committing crimes, stealing and selling drugs. However, every time he was arrested, his father would come to his rescue. For example, Roland once paid 30,000 francs as compensation to the victims of Patrice's thefts. The roots of his behavior possibly trace back to a traumatic event that occurred when he was 13 years old. He ran away from home, and 2 boys abducted him. They drugged the boy with heavy illicit substances and subjected him to abuse in a car, after which they discarded him on the side of a remote road. This couldn't have left scars on a boy who was not yet 14 years old. This certainly doesn't justify what he did afterwards, but it provides an opportunity to better understand him. It was from the age of 14 that he started drinking heavily and using illicit substances. The problem was that Patrick, who was described as charming when sober, completely changed under the influence of some substances. He became truly aggressive to the point where his friends who knew about it were afraid of him. Once, when he was drunk at a bar, someone said something bad about his younger brother, and Patrick flew into a rage. He left, but then returned to the bar with a weapon, which he held to the person's head and pulled the trigger. By some miracle, the gun didn't fire, and Patrick was apprehended. It could have been his first and last murder. Patrice Allegre committed his first attack on a girl when he was only 17 years old. He met the girl at a party, and initially, everything was going fine. They went to a park where Patrice tried to make advances towards the girl, but she pushed him away. As you can already understand by this point, rejections drove him into a ray. The guy started choking the girl but quickly stopped, apologized, and took her home. However, his modus operandi was already beginning to emerge. Interestingly, Patrice never had problems with girls, but the problem was that there were these 2 sides. As long as the girl agreed, he was charming, but if she rejected him, he obtained what he desired by force. As for long-lasting romantic relationships, Patrice had 2 of them in his life. The first one was with a woman named Cécile. They met in 1986 when Patrice was 18, and it was their first true love story. The young couple dated for 7 years, and they had a daughter together. However, in 1989, a few months after committing his first murder, their relationship ended. Their relationship resembled the relationship of Patrice's parents. They would argue a lot, and Patrice would physically attack Cécile. But with Cécile, Patrice could somewhat restrain himself. For example, when he attempted to strangle her, he stopped with the words, "No, not you, not you." In 1994, Cécile ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw. She filed a complaint against Patrice, who was arrested for several weeks. In 1995, Cécile finally decided to break up with Patrice. The following year, he met Sylvie, with whom he would live until February 1997 when Sylvie also left Patrice due to his aggression. It was precisely then that Patrice moved into his friend Eve's house and attacked Emilyists. The trial of Patrice began on February 11, 2002, in Toulouse. He was accused of 6 acts of violence, 5 murders, and 1 attempted murder. During the trial, questions arose about numerous mistakes made by the police during the investigation of Valérie Thariot and Martin Matthias, who concluded it was a suicide. There were even rumors that the police were protecting Patrice, considering his father was one of them. However, this was just a conspiracy theory. Patrice's case was subject to analysis by psychiatrists, which was rare for criminal cases in France. One of the most interesting aspects was his contrasting attitudes towards his mother and father. He idealized his mother but demonized his father. At the age of 13, he even suggested to his mother that they should kill his father. Despite this, Roland Allegre, Patrice's father, appeared in court, took the witness stand, and looked his son in the eyes, saying that despite everything he had done, he still loved him. Patrice's response was, "Well, I don't love you. I hate you. I should have killed you, as I told Mom. Then I wouldn't have caused so much harm." He drew a parallel between his crimes and his father. However, he always refused to blame his mother for anything. Psychiatrists believe that a significant influence on him was the trauma caused by his mother's intimate explosions. Once terrorized by his mother's moans as a child, he transformed into a strong man who terrorized women, suppressing their moans, the very soul of these women. Interestingly, he always attacked his victims when they were unconscious, and the first victim who managed to calm him down, convince him not to kill her, was Emily, who was lucky enough to wake up and speak to him. Such a feeling as if he could render girls unconscious, he could do whatever he wanted with them, but when Emily woke up, she regained her human face. He himself said, "I have a memory lapse. I remember choking her. Then she came to, and I apologized. It brought me to my senses. I'm ashamed of what I did. I don't know what to say." It is also interesting why girls suddenly refused him, even though it seemed obvious that there was an attraction between the young people. The psychologist thinks that he himself provoked the women's rejection, subconsciously, of course. He wanted to have power over the victims because it is common among killers who have themselves experienced violence in childhood. He wanted to transform from a passive victim into an active killer who could fully control the situation. It was their abnormal way of regaining control over the situation. As for the motive, it would seem easy to answer this question since he violated all his victims. However, it's not that simple. Although this explanation seems most obvious, he himself confirmed that he did not derive pleasure during the attacks. According to a psychiatrist who examined him, for someone who sometimes has normal relationships and at other times commits terrible murders, he is not simply a sexual maniac. Having control over the situation was of much greater significance. In essence, it was violence that turned into humiliation rather than humiliation turning into violence. He himself could never answer why he killed. He hoped that psychiatrists would provide him with an answer to this question, which is why he eagerly spoke with them. At the trial, another important question arose. Did Patrice have other victims, especially during the break between 1990 and 1997? Since some of his known victims did not receive proper investigation, it is quite possible. Patrice himself claims that he did not kill anyone else, but can he be trusted? Initially, he only confessed to 2 murders and 1 act of violence. The police formed a team of specialists to determine if he could be responsible for other unsolved crimes. Another promise of a walk, as well as champagne and oysters, allowed them to elicit a hint from Patrice about the unsolved case of Lynn Gabaldi's murder. They examined 191 unsolved cases since 1984, and they managed to find 2 witnesses who were former prostitutes involved in Lynn Gabaldi's case. Florencia Chigliafi, who appeared in the press under the pseudonym Fanny, and Christelle Berg, known to the public as Patricia. Together, they accused Patrice of Lynn's death. However, in addition to him, they implicated the prosecutor of Toulouse, Marc Bourrage, in criminal activities. Allegedly, he organized sadomasochistic parties where politicians and judges would enjoy themselves. Fanny claimed that the girls did not attend the parties willingly. They were subjected to abuse, torture, and sometimes killed, and Lynn Gabaldi provided the prostitutes for the orgies. She threatened to expose everything to the police, so on the orders of Marc Bourrage, Patrice killed her.
Dominique Bodies' name was mentioned once.
He was the former mayor of Toulouse. Supposedly, he was present during Lynn's murder along with Barrage. Seeing the growing tension surrounding his case, Patrice wrote a letter to a well-known show stating that Bodies and Barrage were indeed part of a criminal network. 2 weeks later, the same show aired an interview with Fanny, who talked about the children she saw chained in a torture room on the ground floor of a house near Toulouse. However, just 15 days after confessing to Lynn Gabaldi's murder, Patrice retracted his statement. It was later revealed that the show's producers had generously paid Patrice and Fanny for their stories. It also emerged that Dominique Bodies couldn't have been present at Lynn's murder because he was in Paris. And Marc Barrage didn't even know Patrice. The accusations against the politicians were dropped, and Patrice and Fanny were charged with providing false testimony. In July 2005, Fanny and Patrice were sentenced to 18 months and 3 years in prison, respectively, for giving false testimony. On February 21, 2002, Patrice Allegre was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 22 years. He is now 54 years old and has already served the mandatory 22 years. During this time, he entered into a relationship with a psychologist from Canada who moved to France and settled closer to her beloved in prison. Surely, Patrice wants to see the woman and his daughter outside of prison. He applied for early release but abandoned the idea due to the conclusions of psychiatrists who believe that despite all his efforts, he has not been rehabilitated and the risk of relapse is extremely high. Emily Istz, the only surviving victim of Patrice's attack, who testified against her assailant in court, passed away in 2006, 9 years after the incident. Unfortunately, she made this decision on her own. Amidst the bustling city streets and crowded shopping centers, Lois Pearson always preferred the peaceful seclusion of a small wooden house nestled among green hills where she had grown up. Her family had lived there since her birth in 1949, and Lois hardly ever left her ancestral home. She lived on a modest income from leasing her land to a man who grazed his cattle on it. After her mother's passing, Lois found herself relying more on her own resources. A few years ago, when her pipes froze, she decided to do without running water and carried water from a well. In her daily activities, she used a single lamp, which she carried from room to room on a long cord. Every Sunday, Lois attended church, and once a month, she would travel to the nearest town, Mineral Wells, to buy groceries and do laundry at a self-service laundromat. She always felt more comfortable with animals in nature and often spent entire days without interacting with other people. Lois never had a boyfriend. She never even undressed in front of a man, not even a doctor. Lois met Jeffrey Maxwell in 2001, shortly after he acquired land in Weatherford, Texas, located to the west of her property. At that time, Maxwell was just under 50 years old, while Lois was slightly over 50. They exchanged a few words on occasion, and he would wave to her as he passed by her house. Once, Maxwell invited her to have lunch with him. The invitation caught Lois off guard, and she declined in her usual gentle manner. On another occasion, he came to her house, jumped out of his car, and out of the blue asked for a kiss. Lois felt offended, especially by the expectant smirk on his face. She demanded that he never come to her house again. In 2005, he moved away, but to her immense surprise, they crossed paths again before his departure. Their conversation was brief and unburdened. He stopped by to show her pictures of a modular home he was building in Corsicana and to bid farewell. Little did Lois know that this farewell visit would not be her last encounter with Jeffrey Maxwell. On the afternoon of March 1, 2011, Lois was preparing for her regular trip to town for groceries. She was getting ready to leave when a silver Chevy Trailblazer pulled up behind her 1970 Nova car. If he had arrived just 5 minutes later, he would have missed her. Maxwell warmly greeted Lois and smiled. He stepped out of his car and engaged her in a conversation about the church. As she replied, he began slowly approaching her, and she started backing away. Their movements quickly led them to the back of her house. Feeling slightly embarrassed by the nearby containers of well water, Lois attempted to steer Maxwell back towards the driveway. Suddenly, she noticed a strange shift in his expression. It was so evident that they both stopped talking. Maxwell reached into his coat pocket for a container with an odd lid and held it up to Lois's face. Before she could say anything, he released a stream of pepper spray, attempting to hit both of her eyes. However, the spray had no effect. Lois turned and ran toward the barbed wire fence near her car. Lois had barely reached the fence and put her hands on the top wire when he caught up to her. Grabbing her, he lifted her up, but she held onto the wire even as the spikes dug into her fingers and blood dripped from her hands. Yet he was too strong and managed to throw her to the ground in front of his SUV. Lois attempted to scream as loudly as she could, but her house was secluded and there was no one around. Maxwell picked Lois up again, put what seemed like handcuffs on her, and opened the back door of her house. She struggled to free herself as he pushed her into the kitchen. He grabbed a wooden rolling pin from the kitchen table, her mother's rolling pin, and struck Lois on the left side of her head. When she didn't fall, he swung again, hitting her harder on the right side this time. The blow sent her to the floor. Lois felt her eyelids swell almost instantly, but she continued to fight to escape until he grabbed a large kitchen knife. She sat down quietly, feeling the blood and dizziness. Maxwell asked where she kept duct tape. She remained silent. He repeated the question but got no response. He then cut the cord of her lamp into pieces and tied Lois to the living room door handle. He went outside to his car. He was gone for just a few seconds, but she managed to free her wrists. She had always had rather slender wrists. She jumped up and ran out the door in the opposite direction. By the time he returned to the house, realized she was missing and jumped in his car. Lois had already run a few hundred yards down the road, even with ankle cuffs on. Maxwell chased after her, braking right in front of her and blocking her path. He stepped out of the car with a gun in his hand. "Now we're moving on to Plan B," he said with a chilling expression on his face. He opened the back door of his car and pushed her inside, fastening handcuffs on her again. Then he used a small piece of duct tape to cover her mouth. "Are you a virgin?" he asked, grinning. That's when she started crying. He laughed at her tears, slammed the door shut, and got behind the wheel. As he drove away, he told her he would have to come back and burn down her house. Lois heard the car pulling onto the highway. She thought about trying to lift her feet so that passing drivers would notice her handcuffs and help her, but realizing the car had tinted windows and other drivers wouldn't see her, she felt utterly helpless. She considered hitting Maxwell with a tire iron, but she knew it would only enrage him further. She also thought about opening the back door and rolling out onto the road, but she couldn't find the handle. Maxwell heard her praying and promised that after he was done with her, she would stop believing in him. The car veered off the road. The terrain was unfamiliar to Lois. The abductor led her into the garage of a house and closed the door behind her. She surveyed the room, cluttered with a variety of items. There was patio furniture, a lawnmower, numerous tools, a washing machine, and a dryer in the corner. Maxwell unfastened her handcuffs. He began removing Lois's clothes, everything except her bra. He cut it off with a knife. Then he attached each of her hands to the ends of a steel pole suspended from the ceiling by chains. Without comprehending what was happening, she watched as he flicked a switch on the yellow control panel attached to the ceiling by a cable, at the same point where the chains were connected. She felt her arms rise first, then her shoulders lifted abruptly. The motor in the ceiling hummed as she ascended higher and higher. When Maxwell flicked the switch again, the motor went silent, and Lois felt her naked legs dangling helplessly in the air. Jeffrey Maxwell was known for his ability to escape from any situation, whether it was burning down his own house for insurance money or shooting cattle to avoid feeding them, or even something far more sinister. Maxwell could always manage to avoid punishment. He got to know Martha Martinez from Mexico through postal correspondence in the early 1980s. They exchanged letters for a long time, and eventually Jeffrey traveled to Mexico and proposed to her. Her family wasn't initially fond of him because he skillfully played on her insecurities and lack of self-confidence. Her family begged her not to marry Maxwell, but the 29-year-old woman believed that this was her chance to become a wife and mother. She married Maxwell, moved with him to Watauga, a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, and gave birth to a son. This was Maxwell's third child. At 18, he had married his girlfriend Rita when she became pregnant, but they divorced in 1979 after the birth of their second child. Although Martha kept her husband's behavior hidden from her family, she couldn't hide the bruises on her arms and legs as if from shackles, from her friends. But this was nothing compared to the horror that Martha would experience later. On Sunday, April 19, 1987, a deputy sheriff from Ardmore, Oklahoma, called the police station in Watauga, Texas. He reported that early that morning, they found a woman on the road. She had been severely beaten, and she had lost a lot of blood due to a deep wound on her neck. The woman was Martha Maxwell. The police immediately went to the family's home and questioned Maxwell about the last time he had seen his wife. He claimed not to have seen her since the night before and expressed surprise when told that Martha was injured but alive. Fortunately, doctors managed to save her life. Upon regaining consciousness, she recounted how she and her husband had argued. He beat her and she fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up tied with duct tape. After further abuse, Maxwell forced her to drink a liquid that caused her to immediately fall asleep. She woke up in the hospital. Initially, Martha cooperated with the police, but after her husband's arrest and charges of kidnapping were filed against him, she suddenly stopped communicating with investigators. Without her testimony, the police couldn't charge Maxwell with anything, as a search of the house and car yielded no evidence. Jeffrey Maxwell slipped through the cracks again. Martha took her son and left for Mexico. However, her husband wasn't going to let her go so easily. He bombarded her with letters, playing on her Catholic upbringing and even accusing her of what had happened. Her family pleaded with Martha not to return to Jeffrey, but just a month after the charges against him were dropped, she was back living with him. It seemed like life was getting back on track for the family. Martha enrolled in college, and they bought a new house. But it was just the calm before the storm. On May 10, 1992, two family members received letters from her, or supposedly from her. Martha wrote that she was leaving her husband and son and didn't plan to have any contact for a while. Her family didn't believe that the letters were from Martha. Firstly, she usually just called them. Secondly, if she had written a letter, it would have been in Spanish, not English. When Martha's brother called Maxwell, he said that Martha had left and hung up. He had to come to Texas to file a missing person report for his sister. He was convinced that she was dead, and it was her husband's fault because she would never have left without money, documents, a car, and most importantly, her beloved son. However, the search for Martha yielded no results. Years later, when police asked him if he had done anything that might have led to his wife Martha's death, Maxwell replied, "Not intentionally." A few years after her disappearance, Jeffrey filed for divorce. Once the divorce was granted, he immediately remarried his first wife, Rita, and she and her 3 daughters from her second marriage moved in with him. Soon enough, the girls began complaining at school about their stepfather's advances, and Rita's best friend revealed that just 2 days before their wedding, Maxwell had assaulted her. However, it was only after police visited the family's home due to complaints from Rita's youngest daughter about her stepfather's behavior that Rita took the children, left the state, changed her name, and escaped. Lifting Lois into the air, Maxwell began yelling at her. He was still angry that she hadn't listened to him in the car. The woman felt his hands on her, then sensed something hard and pointed, reminiscent of a plastic bullet. It seemed he was trying to use this vibrating object to cause her pain, and it was truly painful. Stating that Lois would be with him for 2 weeks, Maxwell started hitting her, using different sizes of rods. He struck her everywhere, even on her chest, which was unbearable. Lois could do nothing but scream in agony. When he finally lowered her to the floor, she could barely stand. Maxwell led her to the bathroom and ordered her to wash up. At first, she caught a glimpse of bruises all over her body. Her right eyelid was swollen to the point that she could barely see, fearing she might lose her eye. The abductor himself quickly took a shower and gave her his jeans. They were oversized for Lois and smelled like Maxwell. It was terrible, but she understood that she would survive longer if she didn't provoke him over trivial matters. That night, he chained her ankles to the bed, turned off the lights, and lay down beside her. Lois couldn't close her eyes, and Maxwell hardly slept. Every time she turned toward him, she encountered his round, owl-like eyes, visible even in the darkness. Thus passed her first night away from home in over 40 years. When the morning of the second day came, Maxwell told Lois that he needed to go to the store to buy more padlocks. He led her to the garage and showed her a homemade wooden box. The wood looked and smelled new. He suggested to her a choice, a torture device or a box. Her decision was instantaneous. She would do anything, just not get on that machine. Maxwell inserted a metal ring into her mouth as a gag and secured it with a strap. Then he fastened handcuffs and shackles on Lois and ordered her to lie in the box. Through the gag, she asked if she would have enough air. Maxwell placed a wrench on the edge of the box, leaving the lid slightly ajar, and then left. Lois waited a few seconds after hearing the sound of his car's engine. Then she tried to get out of the box, but no matter how hard she pushed, she only managed to push the key away and lock herself in complete darkness. It was only when Maxwell returned that she realized he had moved the box under a heavy workbench. Upon returning home, the abductor led Lois to the bedroom and undressed her. Her parents had never discussed intimate matters with Lois, and she didn't know what he was doing, but she felt uncomfortable. When she screamed in pain, he asked her how she would like to go to the garage and hang upside down. After that, she tried not to make a sound. When he finished, he chained her legs to the bed again. That night, exhausted, she managed to get some sleep. In the morning, Maxwell had to go to Dallas to pay a bill for his son's repair. He put a gag in her mouth and chained her as usual. Lois could hear cars, motorcycles, and motorboats in the distance. She screamed and called for help, but because of the gag, no one could hear her cries. Only when Maxwell returned and removed the metal ring from her mouth did Lois realize that he had broken her front teeth. But on that day, she lost something much more important. On television, they showed a photo of her driver's license, and Maxwell allowed her to watch the news. That's how Lois Pearson learned that the house where she had grown up, holding so many memories, was no longer there, and she was listed as missing, and they were searching for her. The following days were similar, one to another. In the mornings, he satisfied his needs with her and then left her alone. For several days, he ensured she was chained to the bed, even when he quickly took a shower or went to the mailbox. But gradually, the abductor became less cautious. One day, she noticed he had left his mobile phone in the bathroom. The thought crossed her mind to take it and call the police. But she had never used a mobile phone before and was afraid she might do something wrong. She worried that he would not only stop trusting her, but also use that torture device again. Lois abandoned that idea, but she never stopped pondering an escape, or at least a way to shift the power balance. And after a week in captivity, she saw a way to fend off his persistent advances. On the 7th day, as he lay beside her and moved his mouth towards hers, she recalled her parents' words. They had told her that supposedly there was a bronchitis-inducing agent in her oral cavity. This was one of the reasons why she never kissed boys when she was younger. So, she allowed him to touch her lips, referring to this maneuver as a battle of microbes. What actually happened then is hard to discern now, but the next day Maxwell woke up with a fever and chills. He was pale and could barely get out of bed. He didn't attempt to use her again. On the morning of the 8th day, he demanded that she write him a check for $500. He explained that groceries cost money and instructed her to date it February 2nd, more than a month earlier. He had already taken $60 from her wallet, which she had prepared for shopping in town. But she didn't object, hoping that the money would help her buy a few more days. It was March 12, 2011. The clock's hands were approaching 6 in the evening when Sergeant Ricky Montgomery and 4 other police officers pulled up to a modest house on the shores of a lake in Corsicana, 80 kilometers south of Dallas, to ask the homeowner a few questions about the missing 62-year-old woman. After her house had burned down and her remains were nowhere to be found, search teams began combing the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imaging were brought in for the search, but after a few days, the police came to the grim conclusion that they wouldn't find Lois Pearson alive. The efforts continued with search dogs trained to find bodies, and they even brought in pumps to drain 2 ponds, but the woman was nowhere to be found. Then, 8 days after the fire, $500 were withdrawn from her account. The check was made out to Jeffrey Maxwell and dated a few weeks prior. When the police found out that Maxwell also owned a blue SUV matching the description of the vehicle seen by a neighbor on the day of the fire, a judge issued a search warrant for the vehicle, and officers traveled over 160 kilometers to question the man. Sunday, March 12th, unfolded like any other day. The 12th day of Lois's captivity under Maxwell proceeded like usual. Lois sat on the floor praying, while Maxwell watched television when they both heard a knock at the door. The abductor jumped up and quickly led Lois to a distant room, instructing her to stay quiet. Before he could handcuff her or put a gag on her, they heard another knock, even more persistent. The man hurried to the door. Lois could hear voices from outside but couldn't make out the conversation. She managed to escape the room, and through the window, she saw the word sheriff on a car parked by the road. At first, fear immobilized her entire body, which surprised her. But then she realized it was her chance, and she ran. Jeffrey Maxwell emerged from the house and firmly closed the door behind him. He smiled at the police officers and in an apologetic tone said that his house was in a terrible mess. Sergeant Ricky Montgomery explained that they were questioning people who knew Miss Lois Pearson or those who had recently been in the vicinity of her house. Maxwell replied that Lois was his neighbor, but he hadn't seen her in a long time. He added that Lois had sent him a check because she owed him money. Montgomery continued to ask Maxwell if he would be willing to come to the sheriff's office when the door swung wide open. They heard a weak voice of an older woman. The woman appeared frail, hunched over, her unkempt hair tangled, and her face covered in bruises. She swiftly slipped past Maxwell and approached the officers. Although Montgomery had a photograph of the missing woman, he didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" he asked. Before she could answer, one of the officers behind Montgomery exclaimed in surprise, "It's her, Lois Pearson," she confirmed. Everyone present was momentarily stunned. Regaining their composure, the police officers handcuffed Maxwell. At first, the woman told the officers that Maxwell had been her friend and hadn't done anything to her. Later, she learned about the term Stockholm Syndrome, but all she remembers about her rescue is the fear for her life. After a few minutes, when Maxwell was taken away, Lois told the officers that he had kidnapped her, beaten her, and done things to her that she didn't want. At first, the officers didn't understand what she meant when she mentioned the machine. But as soon as they searched the house, they found the device she described and a yellow control device covered in blood. They also found whips, handcuffs, weapons, 4 adult toys of varying sizes, and numerous pieces of adhesive tape throughout the house. Blood was on the bedding, on the floor in front of the car, and on various items of clothing in the house. The police also discovered an extensive collection of adult films. 3 days of questioning later, Maxwell confessed to nearly everything. The trial began on February 14, 2012. In the months between his arrest and the trial, Maxwell lost over 60 pounds and shaved his beard. Now he appeared as a lanky, ghostly figure in an ill-fitting suit. The jury took less than an hour to find Maxwell guilty on all 3 counts. The judge had prohibited mentioning his wife Martha's disappearance during the trial, but the jurors heard from Rita's friend, whom Maxwell had assaulted 2 days before their wedding. Testimonies were also given by Rita's daughters, who described the impact of stepfather's advances on them. Lois also testified in court. She had always been shy about speaking in public, but now she spoke firmly about what she had endured during those 12 days of captivity. She described the injuries that continued to trouble her even a year later and remembered the 3 cats, Bluey, Blackie, and a nameless kitten that had perished in the fire. Most of all, she thought that if she remained innocent throughout her life, she would be rewarded in heaven. Again, the jury took less than an hour to sentence the defendant to 3 consecutive life terms. The judge ruled that he would not serve the sentences concurrently, meaning that Maxwell would be eligible for parole no sooner than 119 years. After the verdict, a crowd watched as a deputy sheriff handcuffed Maxwell's wrists and shackled his ankles before leading him out of the courtroom. Normally, victims of such crimes don't want their names mentioned in the media, but after the trial, Lois told reporters that she wanted her story to be known so that everyone could hear how her faith had carried her through difficult times. Sometimes she wonders why he chose her. Perhaps Maxwell knew that if she disappeared from home for a few days, no one would notice. The perfect victim. Had he not made a mistake and not put her to sleep, someone might have searched for her. Someone might have noticed she was missing. After the 12 days with Jeffrey Maxwell, Lois was left with memories of her former life. He took away much more than just her home or the car she loved. He took her piano and her mother's sheet music. Now she no longer has a photograph of her father, and she's unsure if one even exists. Her church raised over $17,000 to buy her a small trailer. It's not the home she grew up in, but the old house was always cold in winter and infested with pests, while the trailer is cozy and warm. The church even gifted her a new piano, and she now has a phone. Lois Pearson still prefers the tranquility of nature, but she relishes the time she spends with her new friends. "Before this, I never knew how much I loved people," she confesses. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be. where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store. Since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman getting into a van with a baby. They approached and explained the situation. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store. Since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman. They decided to take it for analysis just in case. Rosgan got in touch with John Flowers to inform him that the police had visited his store. John was quite surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet, but readily answered all the questions. He explained that the bleach smell in the storeroom was because his dog used it as a toilet, and he had to clean up after it frequently. It was possible that's how a tiny drop of blood ended up there. As for the surveillance camera footage and the receipts for the book purchases, he would need to come to the store to look for them and hand them over to the police. Rosgan asked about the books Ginger bought, and this is where the surprise came in. One book was about creating a new identity, and the other was about contract killers. But why did Ginger buy these? Did she genuinely intend to disappear? Or did someone force her to buy these books and then kill her in one of the ways described in the second book? The tiny spot on the wall, possibly blued, turned out to be too small for analysis. Nevertheless, it wasn't very important since everyone already knew Ginger had been in the store and left. What was much more critical was figuring out where she went afterward. Indeed, there were several possible leads, especially considering Ginger's striking beauty and her public performances. Many people, including those with bad intentions, could have noticed her. Moreover, her father worked as a dealer in one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. When it comes to money, things can get messy. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding the girl alive was dwindling. The answer regarding Mark's car came, and guess what? They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at all. At this point, Rosgan thought of John Flowers. He considered the possibility of checking the surveillance camera footage to see if someone had approached Ginger at the store's exit. However, he was too late. Exclaiming, "Where have you been all this time, guys?" John explained that he had reviewed the footage, saw Ginger entering the store, choosing the books, paying in cash, and leaving. Since no one had come for the video, it had been overwritten with new footage from the surveillance camera. John also couldn't find the receipt for the books, although he was certain that it should be somewhere. After this, John seemed unwilling to cooperate further with the detective, partly because his business had suffered due to police, media, and curious onlookers who crowded his shop after Ginger's disappearance. Selling lockpicks and fake police badges in a store that was already filled with law enforcement paraphernalia was understandable, but it put immense pressure on his small business. Rosgan understood this, and there was nothing to push John into talking with them. The case was put on the back burner, and the police had no new leads. In fact, the truth was there, but the detectives working on Ginger's case wouldn't discover it until several more months passed. On May 5th, in the Mojave Desert, nearly 400 miles from Vegas, a group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that the body in the grave belonged to a young, dark-haired girl aged 15 to 18. She had no identification on her, but the killer hadn't taken her quite distinctive jewelry, a pink ring with 3 colored stones and another ring shaped like wire loops, intertwined to form the letter M or W. Could the M signify Mark? Or perhaps it was a family heirloom, because Ginger's mother's maiden name was Watersworth. Hoping for public assistance, the local police published photos of the jewelry, but it would be a very long time before they would learn the truth. In the meantime, to crack the case, the detectives needed a lead or a body. Suddenly, on August 16, 1997, Jeff Rosgan received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as a federal agent from Arizona and claimed to have a lead on the Ginger case. Rosgan was intrigued. The agent explained that John Flowers had been accused of selling illegal eavesdropping devices. But what did this have to do with Ginger? The agent continued. John had gone on the run because he didn't want to be arrested, but his wife, Cheryl Cizone, had been brought in for questioning. They were interested in her husband's whereabouts, but suddenly she started talking about Ginger Rios, who had disappeared in Vegas several months ago. The agent left the room to make a call to Rosgan. It was only now that Rosgan realized he had never formally questioned the owner of the spy shop, the last place Ginger was seen. And yet, Ginger's husband had mentioned that there was a man and a woman behind the counter. Rosgan asked the agents not to let Cheryl out of their sight and hurried to Arizona. Rosgan couldn't have anticipated what Cheryl's interrogation would reveal. When Ginger entered the shop to browse for books, John Flowers turned to Cheryl and asked her to go buy film. This wasn't unusual, as she often ran errands when they worked together at the store. Cheryl returned after about 10 minutes, and that's when Mark walked in. John told Mark that his wife had just left and couldn't have gone far. Mark thanked them and left. Cheryl's husband seemed like a different person. He had a terrified look on his face. She asked him what was going on, and the man replied, "I did something terrible. Whatever you do, don't go into the storage room." Cheryl had no idea what he meant, and it never occurred to her that her husband had harmed someone. However, his behavior unsettled her, and a little while later, she decided to check the storage room. Inside, she found the lifeless body of a young girl with a pool of blood surrounding her head. The carpet was also soaked in blood. The girl had been brutally beaten. It was the same girl who had entered the shop before John had sent Cheryl to get film. Cheryl felt disgusted, but her disgust quickly turned into fear when she realized John was right behind her. She hadn't even turned around when he grabbed her by the neck and ordered her never to speak about what had happened there, or something bad would happen to her as well as their child. Cheryl obeyed his command, but now that John was on the run, she decided to tell the truth. The detective wanted to know how John explained the situation to Cheryl. John told her that Ginger had a note from 2 of his former employees who were demanding money. Supposedly, the contents of the note and Ginger's insolence had infuriated John, and he had hit her so hard in the face that she fell back, hit her head, and died. However, Cheryl was convinced that this was a lie, and she had never seen the note. She did know for sure that John had taken garbage bags and spent several hours in the storage room, wrapping the girl's body in plastic bags and pouring bleach around her. He had told the employee that the dog had used the room as a restroom. Then, he put the body in his van and told Cheryl they needed to leave for Arizona immediately. That's when Ginger's father and husband approached them and pleaded for them to show the surveillance camera footage. John and Cheryl looked them in the eyes and lied, even though Ginger was lying just inches away from them. But that's not all. Cheryl also knew where her husband had buried the body. You see, they had gone to the Mojave Desert several times, John and Cheryl together. One time, John left Cheryl in the middle of nowhere and drove off with their baby and the girl's body. It's clear that he buried her, returned for Cheryl, and drove home. But this wasn't enough for him. They went to that location several more times so John could hide the shallow grave under a layer of concrete. It was only the last time that John came running back panicked and screaming, "They found her! They found her!" So Cheryl was quite certain that the police had already discovered Ginger's body. In any case, she agreed to show the detectives the location in exchange for no charges being filed against her. They accepted her offer because they didn't believe Cheryl had been involved in the murder. She led them to the spot. When they arrived in the desert, the local officers started connecting the dots between the body found by hunters in May and Cheryl's revelation. Cheryl asked them to stop the car and led them to the place her husband had visited. The police expected to find an empty grave, but instead, they reached a concrete slab that appeared untouched. There, they discovered the body wrapped in plastic bags. Thanks to a tattoo on the lower back, they had a preliminary identification as Ginger, but they decided to wait for DNA analysis before informing her family. This raised several unanswered questions. Were there 2 victims? Did John kill both? If so, why and who was the second girl? Now they could secure a search warrant for the Vegas store where they found traces of Ginger's blood. The DNA analysis later confirmed that the body in the desert also belonged to her. Mark, who had clung to the hope that his wife had simply left and started a new life, was devastated. He blamed himself, thinking he should have gone to the store with her. But how could he have imagined that a complete stranger, the owner of a popular and frequently visited store, would attack his wife, someone who was a mother and his loving spouse? John's attempt to hide didn't last long, and he was arrested at a hotel in Los Angeles. The extradition process began, during which the detectives discovered that there was no John Flowers, the owner of the spy store's chain. Instead, there was a 26-year-old Craig Jacobson wanted for crimes committed in Florida. From the age of 10, the boy had struggled with mental health issues, suffering from paranoia, borderline personality disorder, and likely antisocial personality disorder. He spent a year in a mental health clinic and then served 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. However, in 1995, he disappeared. In his place, John emerged. In addition to this revelation, the police found another potential victim of John or Craig. 2 months prior, a teenage girl had entered the Vegas store, but before she could even browse the merchandise, the owner approached her, slung her over his shoulder, and carried her into the storeroom without uttering a word. Her luck was incredible because another customer entered the store and scared John Flowers away, so he released her. This young woman didn't report the incident to the police out of fear, and her word against the word of a respected businessman could have been problematic. This, of course, was before the truth about John came to light. In the following months, psychiatrists examined him multiple times and deemed him unfit to stand trial. The prosecutor was convinced that Craig was faking it, but feared that the crime might go unpunished. He explained to Ginger's family that the best option would be to offer him a plea deal. Craig agreed to plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison before he could be eligible for parole. As for the other girl, Craig mentioned her name as Mary Stoddard. She was the 18-year-old daughter of a chiropractor who had come to Vegas when he kidnapped and killed her. Ginger Rios's relatives hoped that he would be charged with Mary's murder, which could at least result in a life sentence or possibly even the death penalty. But here's the catch. Mary Stoddard, the daughter of a chiropractor as described by Craig, was alive and well. The body of the unidentified girl had already been reburied, but they had previously created a 3D model of what she might have looked like and obtained a DNA sample. This was all the police had, because as it unexpectedly turned out, the documents with information about her place of burial were lost, and no one knew in which grave she was located. In simpler terms, they had lost the body. Nevertheless, the police didn't give up on trying to identify who she was. In their list of missing persons, there were 300 people. Finally, on June 30th, 2010, after 13 years, they managed to identify the girl. More precisely, she turned out to be a teenage girl, as it was 15-year-old Christina Mary Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The girl lived in a group home, but constantly ran away from it because she was treated poorly there. She disappeared on May 3, 1997, while carrying a load of laundry to a self-service laundromat. Her path led her past the Spy Shop in Phoenix. Despite her difficult childhood, Christina had many people who loved her and were looking for her, including her friend Valerie, who never stopped searching for her. Valerie created various social media profiles in an attempt to draw attention to Christina's disappearance. Valerie would say, "No matter how long it takes, I will never stop thinking about her, and I won't give up. For me, she's not just a case number. I loved her. That's true love, never giving up on finding someone." Valerie couldn't have known that Christina was found just a week after her disappearance, in the desert, on her 16th birthday. As for the mystery of the girl's ring, the letter M on it signifies Martinez. Interestingly, the sister of the real Mary Stoddard mentioned that Craig had dated Mary when they were both younger. The guy was already behaving strangely back then, and if this is true, he could have become so fixated on Mary that after parting ways with her, he always sought women who resembled her to vent his anger. Considering that Mary is alive, but Craig called Christina Mary, it's possible that this was a fantasy he played out in his head while committing the crime, as many killers, especially serial killers, do. Most likely, Craig didn't plan his crimes but succumbed to impulsive acts, as was the case with the teenage girl from Vegas who survived because another customer scared the killer away. It's also possible that he targeted victims. As we know, Ginger had been to the store before her disappearance. Craig never revealed the reasons for his behavior, but investigators believe the murders aimed at violence against women because Ginger's underwear was found around her ankles. In any case, now, thanks to being charged with a second murder, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's remarkable that Craig was able to deceive so many people so easily. Mark and George, who were searching for Ginger, his own wife Cheryl, who had no inkling of his hidden nature, and even experienced Vegas police officers who had seen much in their careers. He truly appeared like an ordinary family man, and it makes you wonder where one can feel safe, if not with a store owner standing behind the counter with his wife and baby.